My name is Riley. I'm 33 years old. And the morning after my brother's absurdly lavish Malibu wedding, I opened my banking app and discovered that $250,000 had been wiped clean out of my account overnight. My mother sat across the kitchen island, sipping her latte with the kind of serene, untroubled calm you'd expect from someone discussing the weather, and told me I was still young enough to earn it all back. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply set down my fork, pushed my plate of eggs aside, folded my hands on the cold marble, and quietly decided that my family was about to receive a very expensive, very permanent education in federal tax law. Before I get into it, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from this morning. And if you've ever had to teach a toxic family member that your silence is not the same thing as weakness, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, because trust me, this story earns it. The morning sun was pouring in sheets through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the rented Malibu estate, gilding every surface in that particular golden hour light that real estate photographers dream about. The house itself was a sprawling modern masterpiece of glass, steel, and white stucco, with an infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the churning blue of the Pacific Ocean beyond it. It was, without question, the perfect backdrop for my brother Jason and his brand new wife Kendra to celebrate the beginning of their marriage in front of everyone they wanted to impress. Kendra was a luxury art broker who had built an entire personality around demanding nothing but the absolute finest of everything. The finest hotels, the finest wine, the finest opinions of herself. Jason, whose string of tech startups had failed one after another with almost impressive consistency, was desperate, borderline obsessive, about maintaining the illusion that he was some kind of wildly successful executive. I was sitting alone at the massive marble kitchen island, savoring the rare quiet before the rest of the house stirred awake. I opened my laptop, logged into my banking application, and settled in with my coffee. My goal that morning was embarrassingly simple. I needed to pay the final invoice for the wedding caterer because, as usual, I had already contributed far more than my fair share to this entire wedding, and somehow, as always, it still wasn't enough for them. I typed in my password expecting to see the same familiar balances I checked every single week. Instead, a glaring, unmistakable zero stared back at me from my primary checking account. I refreshed the page twice, telling myself it had to be some kind of glitch, a server error, a caching issue, anything. The number did not change. I clicked into the transaction history with hands that were suddenly, unexpectedly unsteady, and felt every ounce of air leave my lungs at once. A wire transfer for $240,000 had been initiated and had already cleared, just hours earlier, while I was asleep upstairs. The destination was an escrow account I had never seen before in my life. My mother, Brenda, chose that exact moment to glide into the kitchen, wrapped in a plush silk robe, humming some cheerful tune under her breath like she didn't have a single care in the world. She walked straight to the espresso machine, poured herself a cup, stirred in exactly 2 sugars, and turned to face me with the satisfied air of a woman who had slept extremely well. "Good morning, Riley," she said brightly, almost musically. "You're up early." I turned my laptop around so the screen faced her directly. "Someone hacked my account," I said, my voice dangerously, deliberately calm. $240,000 is gone. I need to call the fraud department right now." My mother didn't gasp. She didn't reach for her phone in alarm. She didn't even flinch. She simply took another slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, walked over to the island, and settled into the seat directly across from me as though we were about to discuss brunch plans. "Don't be so dramatic, Riley," she said, waving one manicured hand dismissively through the air. "Nobody hacked anything. I transferred the money myself last night, while you were asleep." I stared at her. my mind stumbling to catch up with what she'd just said out loud in daylight, without a shred of hesitation. "You did what?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly, unnervingly level. "I used that old joint account access," she explained, entirely unbothered, entirely unashamed, as if she were reciting a grocery list. "You remember, the one we set up when you were 18 for your college expenses? I'm still listed as a primary signer on that profile. Did you forget that? I saw all that money just sitting there, doing absolutely nothing productive. Jason needs a $200,000 down payment for the new house in Calabasas. He has to impress Kendra's elite art world friends, you understand. Appearances matter enormously in her industry. The other $40,000 covered what was left of the wedding vendors." She looked at me the way someone might look after explaining a simple recipe, not the way someone looks after confessing to stealing $250,000 from their own daughter. "You stole my money to buy Jason a house?" I said, stripping every last trace of emotion out of my voice. "Oh, stop using such ugly words," she scoffed, rolling her eyes theatrically. "It's family money, Riley. Jason is building a future. A legacy. You're 33, single, and you spend your entire day sitting behind a computer staring at spreadsheets. What do you even need that much cash for? You're still young. You'll earn it back." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of that sentence hung in the air between us like smoke. My entire life, Jason had been the golden child, allowed to fail, allowed to lie, allowed to manipulate his way out of every consequence, while I was quietly, consistently expected to fund his mistakes and smile about it. My parents had spent years draining my resources to prop up his fragile ego. But this was different. This wasn't a few $100s slipped from a shared account or a co-signed lease gone sideways. This was life-altering money, and worse, it wasn't even mine to give away. What my mother didn't know, and what Jason had never once bothered to ask, was the true nature of my job. I didn't just glance idly at spreadsheets all day. I was a forensic accountant, and the account she had so casually, so confidently emptied overnight was not my personal savings account at all. I studied my mother's face, noting the smug, self-satisfied glow radiating from her entire posture. She was waiting for me to cry. She was waiting for me to beg, or scream, or throw some kind of tantrum she could later describe as hysterical to justify what she'd done. I gave her none of those things. I simply closed my laptop with a soft, deliberate click. "You have until 5 o'clock this evening to return every single cent," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow commanded the entire room. My mother laughed, loud and sharp, tossing her head back like I'd told a joke at a dinner party. "Or what, Riley? What exactly are you going to do? Ruin your brother's honeymoon? You are so unbelievably selfish." I stood, picked up my empty coffee mug, and carried it to the sink without a single wasted motion. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show one flicker of fear. I turned back one final time to look at her before I left the kitchen. "I'm not going to do anything, Mom," I said softly, "but the federal government will." Before my mother could even begin to register the full weight of what I'd just said, the kitchen doors swung open. In walked Jason and Kendra, looking like they'd stepped directly out of a luxury lifestyle magazine spread, practically glowing with post-wedding bliss. Jason wore a crisp linen shirt unbuttoned just enough to show off his tan, and Kendra looked effortlessly flawless in a silk resort set that probably cost more than my very first car. But what immediately caught my eye, what I couldn't stop staring at, was the heavy, gleaming metal wrapped around both of their wrists, matching solid gold Rolex watches, catching the morning light every time either of them moved. "Well, good morning to the early birds," Jason announced cheerfully, crossing the kitchen to kiss our mother on the cheek. He didn't so much as glance in my direction. "Mom, That caterer was incredible. The caviar bar was an absolute hit with Kendra's clients. Kendra glided toward the espresso machine, her eyes sweeping over me with practiced, effortless condescension. I was wearing my usual travel attire, a simple tailored navy suit I'd bought off the rack years ago. Practical, professional, entirely invisible to someone who lived and breathed high fashion for a living. "Riley, you're already in a suit?" Kendra sighed, her tone dripping with fake pity. "We're in Malibu. It's the day after my wedding. You really need to learn how to turn off the spreadsheets and live a little for once. You can't take all those pennies with you to the grave, you know. Stop hoarding your money and buy yourself something nice for a change. Maybe hire a personal stylist." I looked at the heavy gold watch sliding down her wrist as she reached for a mug, and quietly wondered exactly how many of my clients' federal tax dollars had gone toward financing that particular piece of jewelry. "I'm afraid my budget is a little tight this morning, Kendra," I said smoothly, "because your husband and my mother decided to empty my bank account while I was asleep." Jason let out a loud, exasperated groan, leaning back against the marble counter with the air of a man deeply inconvenienced by accountability. "Oh, come on, Riley. Are we seriously doing this right now? Mom told me she was going to move some funds around, that's it. It's a family account. I needed to lock down the Calabasas house before another buyer swooped in. And you know my startup is about to close a massive Series A funding round next month. I'll pay you back with interest. Just stop being so dramatic about it." He waved his hand exactly the way my mother had, completely dismissive of the fact that he'd just casually admitted to felony theft. He genuinely, sincerely believed that because he was the golden child, the ordinary rules of the real world simply didn't apply to him. "There is no funding round, Jason," I said, staring directly into his eyes without blinking. "You've defaulted on your last 3 business loans, and that was not a family account. I need $240,000 wired back into my account by 5 o'clock this evening. If the funds aren't there, I won't be the one coming after you." Before Jason could even begin constructing a lie sturdy enough to defend his collapsing business, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. My father, Thomas, marched into the kitchen, clearly having caught the tail end of the conversation, his face already flushed a deep, furious red. He didn't ask what was going on. He didn't ask for my side of the story. He went straight on the offensive, ready to protect his only son the way he always had. My father slammed his fist onto the marble island hard enough to rattle every coffee cup on it. "That is enough," he bellowed, jabbing a thick finger toward my face. "You are not going to stand here and harass your brother on his honeymoon. Jason just got married. He is building a future for this family. All you ever do is count other people's money and complain about it." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I simply looked at the man who was supposed to have protected me my entire life, watching him fiercely defend the son who was, at that very moment, robbing me blind. "I'm not complaining, Dad," I replied evenly. "I'm giving him a deadline." My father sneered, leaning in until his face was inches from mine. "You listen to me very carefully, Riley. If you ruin this weekend, if you make one more threat about this money, I will call my lawyer Monday morning and write you out of my will entirely. You will not see a single dime of my estate. Do you understand me?" The threat was meant to break me. It had always been his ultimate weapon, the leverage he'd used to control me for as long as I could remember. But looking at Jason's smug grin and my parents' furious, righteous faces, I felt absolutely nothing at all. I knew the truth about my father's estate. The second mortgages he'd quietly taken out to fund Jason's failed ventures, the debt he was slowly drowning in. There was no inheritance left to lose, and hadn't been for years. "I understand perfectly," I said. Without another word, I picked up my laptop, slid it carefully into my leather travel bag, and zipped it shut. I slung the bag over my shoulder, grabbed my car keys off the counter, and walked toward the front door. I didn't look back. Let them enjoy their matching watches and their stolen caviar a little longer. The countdown had already begun, whether they realized it yet or not. My hand was just inches from the heavy brass door handle when the sharp vibration of my phone broke my stride. I paused, pulling the device from my coat pocket. The screen displayed a toll-free number I knew intimately, the corporate fraud division of my primary banking institution, a direct security line reserved exclusively for high-net-worth enterprise accounts and corporate clients. I didn't step outside. Instead, I turned slowly on the hardwood floor and faced the kitchen one last time. My family had already drifted back into their celebratory banter, dismissing my exit as nothing more than a temper tantrum. Jason was pouring himself another shot of espresso. My father was clapping him on the shoulder, praising his entirely fictitious business acumen. My mother was admiring her own reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. They looked so completely safe inside their little bubble of entitlement, so utterly convinced that they had won again, just like they always did. I swiped the screen to answer and lifted the phone to my ear. "Miss Riley," a deep, measured voice said, "this is Agent Miller with the Enterprise Fraud Division. We detected a high-velocity wire transfer of $240,000 from your master account at 4 o'clock this morning. Because the destination is an unverified escrow service, our system flagged it for immediate review. Did you authorize this transaction?" The kitchen was still buzzing faintly with low conversation, but I locked eyes directly with Jason. His smile faltered just slightly as he noticed I was still standing in the hallway, staring straight through him. I took a slow breath and spoke with absolute deliberate clarity, making sure my voice carried cleanly across the entire room. "Yes, Agent, that $240,000 was not personal savings. It's a federal tax escrow holding for one of my corporate clients, pending an IRS audit. And no, the wire was unauthorized." The effect was instantaneous and total. The clinking of coffee cups stopped dead. My father's hand froze halfway to Jason's shoulder. My mother spun around, her face draining of color in an instant. The smug, self-satisfied smirk vanished from Kendra's face, replaced by something closer to sheer, unadulterated terror. The room went completely silent. The only sound left in that massive Malibu estate was the low, indifferent hum of the refrigerator. Agent Miller stayed strictly professional on the line. "Understood, Miss Riley. Because this involves federal tax holdings, we're legally required to notify the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and freeze the receiving account immediately. We'll also need to file a suspicious activity report regarding the origin of the authorization. Do you know who initiated the transfer?" I shifted my gaze to my mother. She looked like she might actually be sick. All the color had drained from her cheeks, and her hands were trembling so violently the porcelain cup rattled loudly against its saucer. I let the silence stretch out for 5 long, agonizing seconds, making absolutely sure she felt the full weight of a federal prison sentence hovering directly over her head. "Yes," I replied smoothly. "The unauthorized user accessed the funds through an outdated joint account portal linked to my childhood profile. The primary signer on that old profile is my mother, Brenda. You'll find her digital signature and IP address logged on the transfer record." "Thank you for the confirmation," the agent said. "We're locking down all associated accounts to prevent further capital flight. A fraud packet will be sent to your secure email. We'd strongly advise you to contact your corporate legal counsel immediately." "I'll be filing the police report within the hour," I assured him. "Thank you, Agent Miller." I lowered the phone and slid it back into my pocket. No one in that kitchen moved. No one, as far as I could tell, even breathed. The air had turned suddenly thick with panic. Jason swallowed hard, his entire facade of wealth cracking wide open right there on the marble floor. He knew enough about business to understand exactly what those words meant. Kendra, A woman who had built her whole career on assessing provenance and reputation, instantly calculated the catastrophic damage this would do to her name in the industry. She took a slow, deliberate step away from her brand-new husband. My father, who 2 minutes earlier had been threatening to disinherit me on the spot, stared down at the floor as if the marble tiles had suddenly turned to quicksand beneath him. They had expected me to scream. They had expected me to fight for my money like some desperate child begging for scraps of respect. They had built their entire dynamic on the assumption that they could walk all over me forever, and that I would simply take it, the way I always had. But this time, they had miscalculated badly. I didn't need to raise my voice. The United States government was about to do that for me. "Have a wonderful honeymoon, Jason," I said quietly, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing them all inside their own self-made disaster. I stood on the front porch for a long moment, letting the cool ocean breeze wash over my face. Through the thick mahogany door, the heavy silence inside finally broke. I heard Jason let out a loud, forced bark of laughter, the unmistakable sound of a man desperately trying to convince himself he was still in control of the situation. "Oh my God!" Jason scoffed, his voice carrying easily through the wood. "She actually hired someone to fake a phone call. Did you hear how robotic that guy sounded? What an absolute psychopath." My mother latched onto his denial instantly, her voice climbing in pitch as relief flooded through her. "I knew it," Brenda gasped. "I knew she was just putting on a show. Federal tax escrow, please. She's a glorified bookkeeper. She just wanted to scare us because she's jealous of you and Kendra. She has always been so dramatic. She cannot stand seeing anyone else happy." "Let her throw her little tantrum," my father added, his tone dripping with disdain. "If she wants to play games, let her play. She'll come crawling back the moment she realizes she's alienated the only family she has." I shook my head, a genuine smile finally touching my lips for the first time all morning. Their arrogance was, without question, their single greatest vulnerability. They had spent so many years underestimating me that they couldn't even conceive of a reality where I actually held real power over anything. Given the choice, they'd rather believe a comfortable lie than face the terrifying truth staring them right in the face. I walked down the sweeping driveway toward the heavy iron gates where my ride was already waiting. A sleek black SUV pulled forward, tires crunching softly over the gravel. The driver stepped out to open my door, glancing briefly at my composed, unreadable expression. "Heading to Los Angeles International, miss?" he asked politely. "Yes, please," I replied, sliding into the leather back seat. "And I'm in a bit of a rush." As the vehicle pulled away from the Malibu estate, leaving my family behind in their delusion, I unzipped my travel bag and pulled out my laptop. I connected to the secure mobile hotspot and opened my administrative financial dashboard. For years, I had quietly, dutifully functioned as the financial safety net for this entire family. I co-signed loans to help them secure better interest rates. I kept emergency credit cards active under my own name for their unexpected expenses. I subsidized their entire lifestyle under the polite guise of being a supportive, dependable daughter. That support ended today, permanently. I navigated to the first account on the list, a high-limit platinum credit card I had given my father 3 years earlier, strictly for emergency medical expenses. I pulled up the transaction history and found recent charges for golf clubs and premium cigars instead. With a single click, I suspended the account and reported the card as lost. Next was the auto loan for Jason's luxury sports car, on which I was the primary guarantor. Because he had already missed the last 2 payments, the bank had sent warning notices straight to my portal. I authorized the bank to begin immediate repossession protocols due to breach of contract. Finally, I opened the profile for my mother's revolving credit line, the one she used exclusively to maintain her status at the local country club, charging expensive lunches and spa treatments to my name without a second thought. I revoked her authorized user status entirely, closing the line of credit for good. I watched the status indicators flip, one by one, from active green to a stark, final, locked red. In under 10 minutes, I had systematically dismantled their entire financial infrastructure. I severed every single cord that tied my pristine credit score to their reckless, entitled spending. I hadn't just locked them out of my money. I had locked them out of their own lives, at least the version of it they'd been financing with mine. Right now, they were sitting in a rented mansion, wearing solid gold watches paid for with stolen federal funds, completely unaware that their credit cards had just become nothing more than useless pieces of plastic. No access to cash, no safety net. And they were about to try to survive a luxury resort town with zero purchasing power. I closed the laptop and leaned back against the headrest, watching the palm trees blur past the tinted windows in long green streaks. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched out ahead, bathed in bright morning sunlight, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. The trap was officially set, and the financial freeze was only the opening move. By the time they realized their credit cards were declining across every terminal in the airport, federal agents would already be well into building their case. My family had spent decades treating me like a personal bank, but they had conveniently forgotten one important detail. Banks always, eventually, collect their debts. And when the federal government gets involved, the penalties for missing a payment are exceptionally, unforgivingly severe. I took a long, deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in a full decade. Exactly 4 hours later, I was sitting at my sleek glass desk in my downtown Los Angeles office. The panoramic city view usually commanded my full attention, but that afternoon I was entirely focused on the glowing monitors in front of me, tracking the frozen status of my family's financial accounts in real time. Right on schedule, my cell phone began vibrating violently against the glass desktop. The caller ID displayed Kendra's name. I let it ring 3 full times before calmly pressing accept and lifting the phone to my ear. "Riley!" Kendra hissed, her voice a tight, frantic whisper that echoed faintly, giving away her location somewhere with a high, open ceiling. I am currently standing at the Emirates first-class check-in desk at LAX in the VIP lounge. There is a massive line of my highest-profile clients and colleagues in this terminal, and the ticketing agent is telling me our flights to the Maldives have been canceled due to non-payment. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching a fresh red alert flash across my screen. Another declined transaction attempt from Jason's suspended auto lease account. "Oh," I replied evenly. "That sounds like a very stressful way to start a honeymoon, Kendra." "Do not use that tone with me," she snapped, her voice trembling with a volatile mix of rage and public humiliation. Jason tried to hand them his exclusive black card to rebook the tickets, and the machine declined it. Twice, Riley. The attendant actually asked him, in front of the entire first-class queue, if he had a different form of payment. I have never in my life been so humiliated. Jason is currently on the phone with his bank, screaming at some customer service representative about a system error. But I know this is your doing. You locked the accounts, exactly like you threatened to do this morning. I did warn everyone this morning that there would be severe consequences for stealing federal tax funds, I reminded her gently. I simply removed myself from your financial ecosystem, Kendra. What Jason is experiencing right now isn't a system error. It's reality, finally catching up to both of you. Kendra let out a sharp, ragged breath. I don't care about your petty family drama or whatever accounting fantasy you told your mother this morning. I care about my reputation. If my clients see me turned away from a flight because of a declined credit card, my entire career as a luxury art broker is finished. I need you to wire $50,000 to my personal checking account right this second. Consider it a short-term loan to fix this ridiculous banking glitch you caused. I'll make sure Jason pays you back the moment his startup funding clears next week. Just send the money, Riley. I smiled, though of course she couldn't see it through the phone. Her entitlement was almost impressive in its purity. Kendra, I said slowly, making sure every single word landed with maximum weight. There is no banking glitch. And there is absolutely no startup funding clearing next week, or next month, or ever. Your husband is not a successful tech CEO. He is a serial failure who has been living entirely off my credit score and my savings for the past 5 years. I didn't cancel your first-class tickets to the Maldives. The credit card company canceled them because I refused to pay the past due balance on the card Jason used to book them in the first place. You're lying, Kendra hissed, though the absolute certainty in her voice was already beginning to crack down the middle. Jason showed me the portfolio for the Calabasas house. He showed me the wire transfer for the down payment. Yes, I replied smoothly. He showed you a wire transfer of $240,000 that he and my mother stole directly from a federal tax escrow account. The FBI and the IRS are currently building a wire fraud case against him as we speak. So no, Kendra, I will not be wiring you $50,000 to protect your reputation at an airport lounge. If you want to fly first class to the Maldives, I'd suggest asking your millionaire husband why his own cards are bouncing. Or better yet, maybe ask him to show you his actual tax returns sometime. Before she could hurl another word of denial or scream out another demand, I ended the call. I set the phone back down on the desk, feeling a profound, almost unfamiliar sense of peace settle over me. The elaborate financial illusion my family had built their entire identity on was finally shattering, in real time, in the most public and irreversible way imaginable, and there was absolutely nothing left they could do to stop it. My peaceful moment lasted exactly 15 minutes before the phone on my desk lit up again. This time the caller ID displayed my mother's number. I took a slow sip of water, bracing myself for the inevitable explosion, before finally answering. "Riley, you vindictive little brat!" My mother screamed the instant the line connected, her voice so shrill I had to pull the phone a full inch away from my ear. "What on earth did you do to the credit cards? Jason is standing at the Emirates counter looking like an absolute fool, and my own country club account was just declined for a simple spa treatment. You need to fix this right now." I kept my voice soft, measured, almost bored. "I told you this morning, Mom. I am no longer funding your lifestyle. You have $240,000 of my client's money sitting somewhere. You should have more than enough to cover a massage." "Listen to me, you ungrateful child," Brenda hissed, her tone curdling into something genuinely vicious. "I am entirely sick of this fake federal agent nonsense. You are throwing a tantrum because Jason is getting married and building a real life, while you sit alone in some sterile office. You want to play hardball? Fine, let's play." She paused, taking a deep, theatrical breath. "I know exactly who the managing partners at your firm are, Riley. I have their office numbers saved. If you don't turn those credit cards back on and wire Jason the money to fix this flight situation, I am going to call your human resources department. I am going to tell them you're having a severe psychotic break. I'll say you're mentally unstable, actively trying to extort money from your own family, and completely unfit to handle sensitive financial data. How long do you think you'll keep that high-paying job of yours once your bosses think you're a liability?" It was the ultimate toxic parent maneuver, deployed exactly the way it always had been. Whenever she couldn't control me with guilt, she pivoted straight to threatening my livelihood instead. A few years earlier, a threat like that would have sent me spiraling into blind panic. I would have folded on the spot, terrified of losing a career I'd worked so hard to build from nothing. But today, her threat handed me the exact leverage I needed to lock the federal case shut for good. I needed undeniable signed proof that Jason had knowingly accepted the stolen funds. I needed his signature, in ink, on a legally binding document. I forced my breathing to sound shallow and uneven. I let a calculated silence stretch across the line, long enough to make her believe her threat had landed exactly where she wanted it to. "Mom, please," I said, injecting just the right note of panic into my voice. "Please don't call my firm. You know how strict they are about employee conduct. If you call them, they'll suspend me pending an investigation. I could lose my license over this." I could practically feel the smug satisfaction radiating through the phone. "Then you know exactly what you need to do, Riley," she replied, voice dripping with triumph. "Turn the cards back on and fix this." "I can't just turn the cards back on," I lied, letting my voice shake slightly for effect. "The bank locked everything down because of the wire transfer. But there's a way I can stop the fraud investigation. I can call the bank and reclassify the $240,000 as a one-time familial gift. If I tell them I authorized it retroactively, the investigation drops and your account's clear." "Then do it," Brenda commanded flatly. "There's a catch," I continued quickly. "Because it's such a massive amount of money, the IRS requires a formal gift receipt declaration for my personal tax records. Otherwise, I'll be hit with a massive audit penalty next year. If I'm going to forgive this money and let Jason keep it for the house, he has to sign a legal document acknowledging that it was a gift from me." My mother let out a heavy, put-upon sigh of annoyance, but I could hear, clear as day, that she'd swallowed the bait whole. "Fine," she snapped. "If some stupid piece of paper is what it takes to get you to stop this psychotic behavior, he'll sign it." Since they couldn't fly out that day after all, they were stuck in Los Angeles for at least one more night. I told her my corporate lawyer would draft the document immediately, and we agreed to meet the next morning at a quiet cafe near their rented Malibu estate. "Make sure you bring the paperwork bright and early, Riley," my mother sneered before hanging up, "and try to look presentable for once." I set the phone down and smiled. She thought she had won. She thought she had bullied me into total submission. She had absolutely no idea that she had just personally, successfully brokered her own son's federal conviction. The next morning, a thin layer of Pacific fog was still clinging stubbornly to the coastline when I pulled into the parking lot of an upscale organic cafe a few miles from their rented Malibu estate. I walked inside, secured a secluded booth in the back corner, and set my leather briefcase carefully on the table in front of me. Inside that briefcase was a single sheet of paper my corporate attorney had stayed up until nearly midnight drafting on my behalf. It was disguised, at a glance, as a standard tax exemption form, but the dense legal language buried in the second paragraph constituted a full, undeniable, legally binding declaration of receipt of funds. This document was the final nail in his coffin. In federal court, proving intent is always the hardest part of building a financial crime case. By signing this piece of paper, Jason would be legally, formally admitting that he knew exactly how much money had been taken, and that he was the sole beneficiary of the illicit transfer. 10 minutes later, the front bell chimed and my mother walked in, followed closely by Jason. They both looked visibly exhausted from a night full of declined credit cards and airport humiliation, but they still managed, somehow, to project an aura of total, unshaken superiority. Jason was wearing designer sunglasses indoors, which he slowly, deliberately pulled down the bridge of his nose the moment he spotted me. He strutted over to the booth, slid into the seat across from me, and stretched his legs out with the casual entitlement of a man who had never once faced a real consequence in his life. My mother sat down beside him, crossed her arms, and gave me a long look of pure, unmistakable triumph. Go grab me a double espresso, Riley, Jason ordered, snapping his fingers in my direction as though I were a waiter he'd flagged down. And get Mom a matcha latte. We barely slept last night dealing with that ridiculous bank freeze you pulled. I didn't move an inch. I simply looked at him, keeping my expression perfectly, deliberately neutral. I'm not here to fetch you coffee, Jason, I said quietly. I'm here to get the paperwork signed so I can call the bank and lift the fraud alert. Jason rolled his eyes and let out a long, dramatic sigh. You're always so uptight, he complained, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. You know, you really ruined the vibe of my entire wedding weekend. Kendra is still furious about the airport thing. You're lucky we're even giving you the chance to fix this. Most families would just cut you off completely after a stunt like that. The sheer delusion it took for him to threaten me with abandonment while actively sitting on $240,000 of stolen money was frankly staggering. But I needed him confident. I needed him relaxed, comfortable, feeling completely untouchable. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the crisp white document, along with a heavy black fountain pen, and slid them both smoothly across the wooden table toward him. Here it is, I said, keeping my voice soft, submissive, almost defeated. The gift declaration. It states that I'm retroactively authorizing the transfer, and that you're taking full, permanent possession of the funds for the purchase of the Calabasas property. Once you sign this, I can upload it to my tax portal, and the bank will drop the investigation entirely. Your cards should be active again within the hour. My mother leaned over, trying to skim the document, but the dense legal formatting bored her within about 3 seconds, and she quickly lost interest in reading any further than the first line. Just sign it, Jason, she said, her voice edged with impatience. Let's get this over with so we can get back to the airport and salvage what's left of the honeymoon. Jason lazily picked up the pen, rolling it between his fingers as though he had all the time in the world. He never bothered reading the legal paragraphs that confirmed his voluntary acceptance of unverified escrow funds. He skipped every line explaining that he was waiving any future claim of ignorance regarding the money's true origin. Instead, he looked directly at me with the same smug smile that had carried him through years of manipulation. You see, Riley, he said with a sneer as he clicked the pen open. This is exactly why I'm the CEO, and you're just the accountant. He leaned back confidently. You thought you could corner me with paperwork, but the moment things became serious, you folded. That's the difference between us. I know how to win. You simply don't have the stomach to play in my league. Without another glance, he pressed the pen against the paper and signed his name with a bold, exaggerated flourish. The document slid back across the table toward me. There, he said. Now call the bank and fix my life. I calmly picked up the document, carefully inspecting every detail. The signature was bold, clean, and perfectly legible. Exactly what I needed. Without showing even the slightest hint of satisfaction, I placed the declaration inside a protective folder, slipped it into my briefcase, and snapped both brass locks shut. The sharp metallic click echoed between us. I'll upload it immediately, I said. For the first time that day, my voice no longer sounded hesitant or submissive. It had become calm, controlled, and impossibly cold. Have a safe flight, Jason. Then I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving my brother and my mother sitting at the table, patiently waiting for bank accounts that would never come back to life. The drive to my downtown office took just under 30 minutes, but every mile felt like another step in a plan that had been carefully constructed long before today's meeting. When I arrived, I walked straight past reception without saying a word. The elevator carried me to the executive floor. A few moments later, I stepped inside my corner office, locked the heavy glass door behind me, and placed my briefcase on the desk. I released the brass clasps, removed the signed declaration, and carefully smoothed the crisp white paper across the polished surface. Then I fed it face down into my high-resolution forensic scanner. The machine hummed to life. A bright beam of light swept slowly across the page, capturing every microscopic detail of Jason's signature with forensic precision. Physical evidence, secured. Now it was time to create the digital evidence that would destroy everything else. I settled into my ergonomic chair and woke my multi-monitor workstation. Most people think money simply disappears. It doesn't. Money always leaves fingerprints. Electronic ones. Every transfer creates a trail. Every authorization leaves a timestamp. Every attempt to hide stolen funds only creates another layer of evidence for someone who knows where to look. As a forensic accountant, chasing those invisible trails wasn't just my profession, it was my specialty. I logged into my encrypted investigation portal, bypassed biometric authentication, and accessed the bank's raw backend servers. Gone were the polished customer interfaces and colorful banking dashboards. Instead, my screens filled with endless rows of transaction logs, routing records, authorization hashes, server timestamps, encrypted authentication tokens, and IP metadata. This was where the truth lived. The first objective was simple: locate the exact moment my mother accessed the escrow account. I searched for the $240,000 wire transfer. Within seconds, the database returned the transaction. Thousands of characters appeared across the screen. I isolated the authorization chain. As expected, my mother had logged in using her old legacy credentials from the period when she still had limited access to the family profile. Normally, that would never have been enough to authorize a transfer of that size, which meant she had needed something else, a second layer of authentication. I expanded the security logs. There it was. She had digitally forged my electronic signature, exactly as I suspected. Next came the network data. I extracted the IP address attached to the authorization request. 30 seconds later, I had completed a full geolocation trace. The signal originated from a cellular tower overlooking the Malibu coastline. I cross-referenced the device registry. One match. Her personal tablet. She hadn't stolen nearly $250,000 from some dark office hidden halfway across the country. She had done it while relaxing on a beautiful oceanfront patio. I exported every relevant file: the geolocation report, the device identification records, the authentication logs, the forged authorization sequence. Each piece of evidence was added to a secure, encrypted master folder. At that point, the identity theft charge became virtually impossible to dispute. But proving theft wasn't enough. I wanted the money itself. Because money never truly stops moving. Federal funds echo through every institution they touch. I traced the interstate routing numbers. The transaction had traveled from my California corporate escrow account through a regional clearing facility in Nevada before ultimately settling inside an unverified third-party holding account. That immediately caught my attention. I launched another investigation. Less than 5 minutes later, the ownership records appeared. I couldn't help smiling. The account belonged to a shell corporation established by the Calabasas real estate broker responsible for closing the property purchase. Everything suddenly aligned. By routing stolen federal tax funds across state lines and funneling them through a shell company to finance real estate, they hadn't merely committed theft anymore. They had created a textbook federal money laundering operation. My monitors filled with interconnected transaction maps. Each node connected another participant. Each financial pathway strengthened the case. Jason believed the document he had signed was nothing more than a harmless formality. In reality, it became the final piece connecting him directly to every illegal transaction. No jury would ever believe he had been an innocent bystander. He had willingly acknowledged ownership of assets purchased with stolen federal funds. His own signature guaranteed it. I created 3 encrypted evidence folders. Folder 1 contained the raw banking logs, authentication records, geolocation reports, and proof of my mother's digital identity theft. Folder 2 held the interstate routing history, shell company registration documents, and complete money laundering trail. Folder 3 contained the forensic scan of Jason's freshly signed declaration, the document proving he knowingly accepted control of the stolen assets. After verifying every file, I compressed the entire directory into a heavily encrypted evidence package. Then I picked up my office phone and dialed my corporate attorney. He answered before the second ring. "I have everything," I said. Silence lingered for a moment. Finally, he spoke. "Riley, are you absolutely certain?" His tone was careful. "Once I forward this package to the federal agencies, there's no reversing it. The investigation will take on a life of its own. Mandatory sentencing guidelines, asset forfeiture, criminal prosecution. Once the government starts moving, it doesn't stop." I looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Los Angeles skyline. They made their choice the moment they touched that account. Another pause. Then I continued. "Send everything immediately to IRS Criminal Investigation and the local FBI field office." I took a slow breath. "And include a formal request for an emergency asset forfeiture warrant covering the Calabasas property." "Understood," he replied. "I'm transmitting now." The call ended. I leaned back quietly as confirmation notices began arriving inside my encrypted inbox one after another. The evidence package was already traveling through secure fiber optic networks toward multiple federal agencies. Meanwhile, my family was still sitting inside a cafe, waiting for bank accounts that were never going to unlock. They had absolutely no idea that an unstoppable federal investigation had already begun, and that every minute brought it closer to their front door. The trap had finally closed. While I remained in my office watching encrypted delivery confirmations appear one after another, a very different chain of events was unfolding back at the rented Malibu estate. The details would only become clear weeks later during the divorce depositions, but the sequence itself was almost painfully predictable. My mother and Jason returned to the mansion shortly before noon, overflowing with confidence they had done absolutely nothing to earn. They swept through the front doors as if they owned the world. Kendra was already pacing the grand living room, still dressed in the elegant outfit she had worn to the airport. Her designer luggage remained untouched beside the entrance, a silent reminder of the honeymoon that had never happened. Jason walked straight to the polished bar cart, poured himself an expensive whiskey, and raised the glass with absolute confidence. "It's handled," he announced proudly. Riley finally came to her senses. He took a slow sip before continuing. "She signed everything. The release forms are done. The bank just needs a few hours to process the paperwork. By tonight, all of my accounts will be fully operational." Kendra folded her arms. "If that's true," she asked evenly, "why were our cards declined this morning?" Jason didn't hesitate. He smiled with practiced confidence. "International fraud protocols," he replied. "Whenever accounts are temporarily frozen, the bank usually imposes a mandatory 24 to 48-hour verification period. It's completely routine." He shrugged as though explaining the weather. "So instead of rushing back to the airport, let's just enjoy the Malibu house for the weekend." Brenda immediately stepped beside him. She gently squeezed Kendra's shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said warmly, "don't let Riley ruin your honeymoon. She's only acting out because she's jealous. She can't stand seeing Jason happy." But Kendra wasn't the type of woman who accepted explanations simply because they sounded convincing. Her career had been built inside the ruthless world of luxury art brokerage. Every day she authenticated priceless paintings, negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions, coordinated international wire transfers, and dealt with collectors whose fortunes depended on absolute financial precision. She understood banking systems, she understood escrow, she understood payment holds, And most importantly, she knew that genuinely wealthy people did not have their elite black credit cards declined at airport terminals. Not unless something was catastrophically wrong. Still, she smiled politely. "You're probably right," she said. "I'll go unpack." She carried her luggage upstairs without another word. The moment she heard Jason laughing outside as he jumped into the infinity pool, her expression completely changed. Years of professional survival instinct quietly took control. She walked directly toward the enormous king-sized bed where Jason's expensive leather travel bag rested. Jason loved looking successful. He carried oversized portfolios filled with contracts, presentation folders, and glossy business documents, not because he actually needed them, but because they completed the image he wanted people to believe. Kendra unzipped the bag. Her heartbeat accelerated. She lifted the thick leather portfolio onto the bed and opened it. The first pages were exactly what she expected. Beautiful presentation decks, luxury renovation concepts, flashy technology proposals, worthless marketing material. She skipped them all. She wasn't looking for promises. She wanted numbers. Real numbers. She continued turning pages until she reached the final section. There it was. An official escrow settlement statement. As someone who had reviewed hundreds of luxury property closings, she immediately recognized the format. Her finger slowly traced each line. Purchase price, closing costs, escrow adjustments, buyer credits, earnest money deposit, primary down payment. She stopped. The figure listed was exactly $240,000. Her breathing slowed. Then she looked at the originating account. She expected to see Jason Corporate LLC, or Apex Tech Solutions, or one of the many companies Jason constantly bragged about. Instead, printed clearly beside the routing information were 4 devastating words: Riley Corporate Tax Escrow. Kendra stared at the page. For several long seconds, her brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Then, everything Riley had said inside the airport lounge came rushing back. Jason wasn't a successful entrepreneur. He had survived entirely on Riley's financial support. The honeymoon had collapsed because Riley stopped paying his debts, and the down payment for this dream house had been stolen directly from a federally protected escrow account. Every scattered piece suddenly locked into place. She looked around the luxurious bedroom, the custom furniture, the imported stone, the designer fixtures, the breathtaking ocean view. None of it represented success. It represented fraud. Jason wasn't suffering from temporary cash flow problems. He was bankrupt, desperate, and willing to steal from his own sister to manufacture the illusion of wealth. Even worse, his mother had helped him do it. A cold wave of panic spread through her body. If Riley's warnings about the FBI and IRS were true, Kendra had just married a man standing on the edge of a federal criminal indictment. Carefully, almost mechanically, she returned every document to its exact position. The settlement statement slid back into the portfolio. The portfolio disappeared inside the leather bag. The zipper closed exactly where it had been. No trace remained. She walked silently into the master bathroom, locked the heavy wooden door behind her, and stared at herself in the mirror. Her face looked noticeably paler than it had that morning. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. Instead, she unlocked her phone. Within seconds, she was searching one thing: best white-collar criminal defense attorneys in Los Angeles. Exactly 1 month passed. Many people later wondered why Kendra didn't immediately file for divorce after discovering the truth. The answer was simple: reputation. Everything she had spent years building depended on perception. Among wealthy collectors, image mattered almost as much as money. A marriage that collapsed only days after an extravagant society wedding would become gossip overnight. Clients would question her judgment. Competitors would exploit the scandal. Collectors would quietly take their business elsewhere. Her attorney offered one piece of advice: maintain appearances, smile, host dinners, attend events, pretend everything is perfect, until the federal government makes the first move. So she played her role flawlessly, which brings us to a crisp Saturday evening exactly 1 month later. Jason and Kendra were hosting an extravagant housewarming party inside the $1.5 million Calabasas property purchased with stolen federal tax funds. The irony was almost unbearable. As I drove into the neighborhood, strands of elegant lights illuminated the modern estate like something from an architectural magazine. Luxury vehicles lined both sides of the street. Professional valet attendants hurried from car to car. Somewhere inside, a live string quartet floated through the open windows while crystal glasses clinked beneath bursts of sophisticated laughter. To every guest arriving that evening, it looked like success. To me, it looked like a crime scene waiting for federal agents. Inside, the atmosphere was nothing short of extravagant. The sprawling living room had been transformed into a showcase of wealth and exclusivity. High-profile gallery owners mingled with billionaire collectors. Renowned art consultants exchanged business cards beneath sparkling crystal chandeliers, while waiters in tailored black uniforms drifted effortlessly through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with imported caviar, fresh oysters, handmade truffle tartlets, and vintage champagne. Everything had been designed to impress. Kendra moved gracefully from guest to guest wearing a breathtaking emerald green evening gown that looked as though it had been custom-made for her. She laughed at polite jokes, introduced influential clients to one another, and welcomed every arrival with effortless elegance. To anyone watching, she appeared to be completely in control. The perfect hostess, the perfect wife, the perfect success story. But appearances can be remarkably deceptive. I noticed the tiny details no one else saw. Every time headlights swept across the front windows, her eyes instinctively darted toward the driveway. Whenever a car door slammed outside, her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. She smiled constantly. Yet every smile disappeared the instant no one was looking. She wasn't enjoying the evening. She was counting down to something she desperately hoped would never happen. Jason, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the disaster racing toward him. He stood confidently beside the enormous marble fireplace with a crystal glass of 20-year-old scotch resting comfortably in one hand. Around him gathered several wealthy investors Kendra had proudly introduced earlier in the evening. Jason was in his element, or at least he believed he was. He spoke with absolute confidence about an upcoming funding round that didn't exist. He described revolutionary software platforms that had never been developed. He promised explosive market disruption, global expansion, strategic acquisitions, and future billion-dollar valuations with the smooth confidence of someone who had repeated the same lies so many times that he had eventually begun believing them himself. The investors nodded politely. Some appeared interested. Others simply enjoyed the entertainment. Jason couldn't tell the difference. He genuinely believed he belonged among them. Across the room, my parents were equally intoxicated, not by alcohol, but by the fantasy they had created. Brenda wore a brand new designer gown that she could never have afforded a month earlier. Holding an expensive reserve wine, she eagerly gave guests guided tours of the house, proudly pointing out imported stone countertops, handcrafted cabinetry, custom lighting, and every luxurious architectural detail as though she personally deserved the credit. She enthusiastically explained how proud she was of her brilliant son, how Jason had supposedly built a thriving technology empire through intelligence and determination. Not once did she mention that she had personally forged my electronic authorization to steal the money that financed every square foot of the house she was so proudly displaying. Outside on the patio, my father stood beside the enormous fire pit smoking an expensive Cuban cigar. He looked relaxed, confident, triumphant. For the first time in decades, Thomas truly believed his gamble on the family's golden child had finally paid off. They had constructed an entire kingdom out of stolen federal money, and tonight they were celebrating its coronation. The illusion had become so convincing that they had forgotten reality altogether. Exactly 1 month earlier, I had warned them. I had told them federal investigators would come. I had explained precisely what would happen. Nothing had happened immediately. My bank accounts eventually became accessible again. No police officers had knocked on their door. No agents had arrived with warrants. So they convinced themselves I had been bluffing. They believed they had beaten the system. They believed they were untouchable. They believed wealth made them invisible. They couldn't have been more wrong. I stood quietly outside the entrance for several seconds. No invitation had ever arrived. In fact, my mother had gone out of her way to make sure I knew I wasn't welcome. According to her, my boring corporate personality would only ruin the sophisticated atmosphere they were trying so desperately to create. She wasn't entirely wrong. I wasn't there to celebrate. I wasn't there for champagne. I wasn't there for caviar. I had come for something far more satisfying. I wanted to witness the moment their fantasy collapsed. Taking one slow breath, I stepped out of the evening shadows and walked toward the massive custom oak doors that stood wide open. The cool California breeze drifted effortlessly through the grand entrance. I crossed the threshold. For years, my family had mocked the way I dressed. They laughed at my tailored business suits, called them lifeless, plain, forgettable. They assumed I dressed modestly because I couldn't afford anything better. Tonight would challenge that assumption. I wasn't wearing an ordinary department store suit. Every piece had been custom tailored. The charcoal gray jacket fit perfectly across my shoulders. A silk white blouse disappeared beneath its structured lines. My hair had been professionally styled into a sleek, polished finish. Every detail projected quiet authority. I didn't look like the forgotten daughter anymore. I looked exactly like what I had become, a highly respected corporate investigator walking calmly toward the biggest case of her career. Crystal light cascaded from the enormous chandelier overhead, reflecting across polished marble floors that had been purchased with stolen money. I had barely taken another step when I noticed movement. My father had seen me. Thomas immediately excused himself from the group gathered near the indoor bar. The warmth disappeared from his face instantly. His confident smile collapsed into naked panic. He marched toward me with hurried, aggressive strides. Before I reached the living room, he planted himself directly in front of me, blocking my path. Without hesitation, he grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug painfully into the sleeve of my designer jacket. "What the hell are you doing here, Riley?" he hissed through clenched teeth. His eyes darted nervously around the foyer to make sure none of the wealthy guests were paying attention. "I told your mother to keep you away from this house." His grip tightened. "You weren't invited." His voice dropped even lower. "You're nothing but trash trying to ruin an elegant evening." I slowly lowered my eyes to the hand gripping my arm. Then I looked back into his face. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I simply stared at him in complete silence. The lack of any emotional reaction unsettled him far more than anger ever could. "Leave now," he whispered furiously. "Before I have security throw you off the property." He tugged my arm toward the front door. "Jason is finally becoming someone important." His breathing grew heavier. "I won't let some jealous, bitter spinster destroy everything he's built." He expected tears. He expected pleading. He expected the same quiet daughter he had bullied for years. Instead, I calmly twisted my wrist, broke his grip with one smooth movement, and stepped around him. Then I did something he never expected. I raised my voice, not loudly, but clearly enough for every conversation nearby to come to a complete stop. "Thomas!" I smiled brightly. "I have to say." I slowly looked around the magnificent foyer. This architecture is absolutely spectacular. The room became noticeably quieter. Several conversations faded. Guests turned to look. I continued smiling. "The vaulted ceilings are extraordinary." I gestured elegantly toward the marble beneath our feet. "And this imported flooring is simply breathtaking." Then I turned back toward my father. "You and Jason have created something truly remarkable." I paused deliberately. "Don't you agree, Dad?" Silence settled over the foyer. Thomas froze. For one terrifying moment, he became the center of attention. Every wealthy collector, every investor, every gallery owner was looking directly at him. If he shouted now, if he insulted me, if he forced me out physically, he would destroy the polished image of sophistication he had spent months trying to create. He had trapped himself. His jaw tightened. He swallowed hard. Finally, a painfully artificial smile spread across his face. "Yes," he muttered. It is a beautiful house." I smiled even wider. "Thank you for such a warm welcome." I nodded politely. "I think I'll go congratulate the happy couple." Leaving him completely speechless, I walked past him and disappeared into the center of the party. The fortress had been breached. Now the real game could begin. I accepted a crystal flute of champagne from a passing waiter, thanked him with a polite nod, and slowly surveyed the crowded room. The first phase had gone exactly as planned. I was inside. Now all I had to do was find Kendra. She stood near an elaborate champagne tower in the formal dining room, speaking with a prominent private art collector whose face I recognized from Forbes magazine. From a distance, she looked every bit the accomplished hostess. Graceful posture, confident smile, flawless composure. Only someone watching as closely as I was could recognize the truth. Her fingers were gripping the stem of her champagne glass so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Every few moments, her gaze drifted toward the front entrance before snapping back to her guest. She wasn't hosting a celebration. She was waiting for disaster. I moved quietly through the crowd, blending naturally among the expensive tailored suits and designer evening gowns. Nobody gave me a second glance. By the time I reached her, the collector excused himself to answer a phone call. The moment he disappeared into the crowd, Kendra turned to reach for another champagne flute. Then she saw me. Her smile vanished instantly. The warmth drained from her face. "What are you doing here, Riley?" she whispered, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. She stepped closer, instinctively trying to shield our conversation from everyone nearby. "If you're here to cause a scene," she continued under her breath, "I'll have security remove you for trespassing. This is my house." I calmly raised my champagne to my lips and took a slow sip. The bubbles burst softly against my tongue. Then I smiled. "I'm not here to make a scene, Kendra." My voice remained quiet, almost conversational. "And you and I both know this isn't your house." I glanced toward the marble floor beneath our feet. "We both know exactly whose money paid for it." Her throat tightened visibly. She swallowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." The words came out automatically. Neither of us believed them. "Really?" I asked gently. "He told you the money came from his corporate account." She nodded almost imperceptibly. "He showed me the settlement documents." "I know." I smiled again. "He showed you the settlement statement." I leaned slightly closer. The same settlement statement listing my corporate tax escrow account as the source of the wire transfer. For a brief moment, she stopped breathing. I could see the memory returning. The airport, our conversation, my warning. "I saw your expression that day," I continued calmly. "You didn't believe me at first." Another pause. but you're too intelligent not to investigate. She remained silent. You work in luxury art, I said. You authenticate paintings worth millions of dollars. You spend your career identifying masterpieces from forgeries. I looked directly into her eyes. So tell me, how did you fail to authenticate your own husband? The question struck harder than I expected. Every trace of color disappeared from her face. She looked physically ill. I kept my tone gentle. Did you ever ask to see his tax returns? No. His audited financial statements? She lowered her eyes. No. His actual corporate accounts? Silence. Only the music from the string quartet drifted softly through the room. He told me, she whispered, that everything was just a misunderstanding. I nodded. Jason lies the way other people breathe. The words landed between us with brutal simplicity. There is no technology company. No venture capital. No Series A funding. No successful business. There are only default notices, unpaid credit cards, personal loans, and debts that I stopped covering exactly 1 month ago. I watched her carefully. She already knew. She simply needed someone to say it aloud. You didn't marry a successful entrepreneur. I paused. You married an illusion. The champagne suddenly seemed far too heavy in her hand. And because you legally tied your future to his, I lowered my voice even further. You're standing directly inside the blast radius of a federal criminal investigation. Her breathing became shallow. What? She whispered. What happens now? I looked around the magnificent house, the laughter, the expensive artwork, the imported marble, the crystal chandeliers. Every luxury surrounding us had been purchased with stolen federal funds. In federal cases, I explained quietly, there's a process called asset forfeiture. She stared at me. If investigators determine this property was purchased with criminal proceeds, I slowly gestured around the room. They don't simply take the house. They seize everything connected to it. I watched genuine terror spread across her face. Joint accounts, business assets, luxury purchases, vehicles, investment portfolios. In certain circumstances, I paused. Even professional licenses become part of the investigation. Her lips parted slightly. She looked as though she might collapse. I gently rested my fingertips against her arm. To everyone watching nearby, it appeared to be a comforting gesture between two acquaintances. Only we knew what was actually happening. If I were you, I said softly, I'd stop worrying about tonight's party. I smiled politely. And start finding Jason's real financial records. I took one final sip of champagne. You deserve to know exactly how much prison time your husband may have brought into your marriage. Without waiting for a response, I stepped away. The crowd immediately swallowed me. Behind me, Kendra remained completely motionless beside the champagne tower. The elegant facade she had maintained for the past month had finally cracked. Within seconds, she abruptly set her glass onto a passing waiter's silver tray. The crystal struck the metal with a sharp, unmistakable click. Ignoring several confused guests who attempted to stop her, she hurried toward the grand staircase. She wasn't thinking about appearances anymore. She wasn't thinking about the party. She wasn't even thinking about Jason. She was searching for one thing: the truth. Her heel staircase. She wasn't thinking about appearances anymore. She wasn't thinking about the party. She wasn't even thinking about Jason. She was searching for one thing: the truth. Her heels echoed rapidly against the marble steps as she climbed to the second floor. At the end of the hallway stood Jason's private office. He loved calling it his executive headquarters. Solid mahogany doors, heavy brass hardware, a commercial-grade deadbolt. Everything about the room had been designed to project the image of an important CEO protecting billion-dollar secrets. Kendra knew something else. A week earlier, she had watched Jason casually hide the spare key inside a decorative porcelain vase on the hallway console. She walked directly to it. Her fingers searched beneath the artificial flowers. Cold brass touched her fingertips. She pulled out the key. A second later, the lock clicked open. Kendra slipped into the office and quietly locked the heavy door behind her. She resisted the urge to switch on the ceiling lights. Instead, she reached for the small brass banker's lamp resting on the edge of Jason's oversized oak desk. A warm pool of light spread across the polished wood, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. At first glance, everything looked exactly as Jason wanted people to see it. Framed motivational quotes decorated the walls. A sleek laptop sat perfectly centered on the desk. Industry magazines were arranged with almost obsessive precision. Awards from meaningless networking events had been carefully positioned where visitors couldn't miss them. It looked like the office of a successful technology executive. Kendra wasn't interested in appearances anymore. She walked straight past the computer. Jason always protected his digital files with passwords. Paper was far more honest. She crouched beside the heavy wooden filing cabinet tucked beneath the desk and pulled open the top drawer. Folders overflowed from every corner. Without hesitation, she grabbed the thickest stack and spread the documents across the desktop. Her eyes raced from page to page. There were no venture capital agreements, no investment contracts, no acquisition proposals. Instead, collection notices, past due balances, formal demands for immediate payment. She unfolded another letter. A luxury sports car lease had entered default. The finance company was threatening repossession. Another envelope contained a demand from a private lender insisting on repayment of a $50,000 personal loan. Then came the credit card statements. One after another. Every account had reached its maximum limit. Every payment was overdue. Interest charges had snowballed into staggering amounts. The deeper she searched, the more obvious the truth became. Jason didn't own a thriving business. He was drowning. Every document painted the same picture: debt, desperation, collapse. A cold sweat formed along the back of Kendra's neck. She pushed the stack aside and opened the bottom drawer. Hidden beneath several packs of unused printer paper rested a thick ivory envelope. An official government seal was printed neatly in the upper corner. Her heartbeat accelerated. She carefully removed the letter. The return address immediately caught her attention. Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. Her hands began to tremble. She unfolded the document. It wasn't addressed to Jason. It wasn't addressed to her. It had been sent directly to my corporate firm. The subject line referenced the exact escrow account I had warned her about at the airport. She continued reading. The letter documented an unauthorized wire transfer totaling $240,000. It stated that federal investigators had already opened an inquiry. Most chilling of all, it warned that any property purchased with those stolen funds would become subject to immediate federal seizure. The paper slowly slipped from her fingers. It landed softly across Jason's leather desk pad. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Every terrifying word I had spoken downstairs had been true, not exaggerated, not manipulative, not revenge, truth. The beautiful house surrounding her, the expensive furniture, the imported marble, the catered food, the luxury vehicles parked outside. Everything had been financed through stolen federal money. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Her knees suddenly felt weak. For more than 10 years, she had built an impeccable reputation inside one of the most exclusive industries in the country. Collectors trusted her. Museums respected her. Elite clients sought her advice. Now, she had legally tied her future to a man heading toward a federal indictment. When investigators arrived, they wouldn't care whether she had learned the truth before or after the wedding. They would freeze accounts, Review transactions. Seize assets. Examine business records. Her professional reputation could disappear overnight. She looked toward the digital clock glowing softly on Jason's desk. Downstairs, wealthy guests were drinking champagne and laughing beneath crystal chandeliers. Upstairs, her entire future was collapsing. She carefully returned every document to its original position. The IRS letter disappeared back into the ivory envelope. The envelope slid beneath the printer paper exactly as she had found it. She locked the filing cabinet, switched off the lamp, opened the office door. Survival had become her only priority. She had barely stepped into the hallway when Jason appeared at the opposite end. He was climbing the staircase carrying an empty crystal tumbler. The smell of expensive scotch mixed awkwardly with overpowering cologne. The confident smile he wore downstairs was still firmly in place. "Hey, babe," he said casually. "There you are." He laughed lightly. "Everyone's asking where you've been. The caterers want to know if it's time to bring out dessert." Kendra didn't answer. She walked directly toward him. Before Jason could react, both of her hands shot forward and grabbed the lapels of his tailored blazer. With surprising strength, she slammed him backward against the hallway wall. The impact echoed through the corridor, fortunately drowned out by the music floating up from the party below. Jason stared at her in complete disbelief. "What the hell?" He tried pulling away. "You're going to wrinkle the jacket. I found the files." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Yet every word carried enough fury to stop him cold. "I unlocked your office." His smile vanished. "I read the collection notices." Silence. "I saw the credit card statements." Jason's breathing slowed. "And I found the IRS letter." Every trace of color drained from his face. For the first time since I had known my brother. He looked genuinely afraid. He opened his mouth. Another lie was already forming. Kendra didn't let him speak. "Don't." Her grip tightened. "Don't insult me by lying again." Her fingernails pressed into the expensive fabric covering his chest. "Riley told me everything." Jason swallowed. I wanted to believe she was angry. His breathing became uneven. I wanted to believe she was exaggerating. She leaned even closer. But she wasn't. Her eyes burned with fury. "You're not a successful CEO. You're bankrupt. You're a fraud. And you stole federal money to finance this fantasy." Jason glanced nervously toward the staircase. "Kendra," he whispered desperately, "listen to me. It's temporary. I've got investors lined up. I'll replace every dollar before the government notices. I only needed this house to create the right image." He forced a weak smile. "The optics matter." Kendra stared at him as though looking at a complete stranger. "The optics?" She laughed once. A cold, empty laugh. "You gambled my career. My reputation. And possibly my freedom. For optics?" Before Jason could force another excuse out of his mouth, the old wooden floorboards creaked behind them. Brenda appeared at the top of the staircase, casually carrying a fresh glass of wine. She had come upstairs looking for a quiet break from the party, but the moment she saw Kendra pinning Jason against the wall, her expression hardened. "What on earth is going on?" she demanded as she hurried toward them. "Kendra, let go of your husband this instant." Kendra slowly released Jason's jacket but never took her eyes off him. "Your son is a federal criminal." Her voice was calm now, dangerously calm. "He has no fortune. He has no company. He stole federal tax money to buy this house. And you helped him?" Brenda didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She didn't even pretend to deny it. Instead, she rolled her eyes with open annoyance and took another slow sip of wine. "Oh, honestly," she scoffed, "stop being so dramatic." She waved her free hand dismissively. "Jason is a visionary. Visionaries have to bend the rules sometimes." She smiled as though explaining something perfectly reasonable. That money was just sitting in Riley's account doing nothing. We simply put it to better use. For several long seconds, Kendra couldn't speak. She stared at her mother-in-law in complete disbelief. You stole nearly $250,000 from a federally protected account. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. And you're proud of it? Brenda shrugged. A good mother supports her son. Then she looked directly into Kendra's eyes. And a good wife stands beside her husband. The words landed like poison. Kendra slowly shook her head. No. She took one deliberate step backward. I didn't marry an ambitious businessman. She looked at Jason with open disgust. I married a liar. Another step. I married a fraud. Jason finally found his voice. Kendra. He reached toward her. Please. You don't understand. I can fix this. She laughed bitterly. Fix it? You forged an entire life. You lied about your business. You lied about your finances. You lied about the house. You even lied about where the down payment came from. Her breathing grew heavier. Every promise you've ever made was built on stolen money. Jason desperately tried to regain control. I only needed a little more time. The investors are real. I've got meetings scheduled. Everything's about to turn around. She stared at him for several silent seconds. Then she asked the simplest question of the entire evening. What investors? Jason froze. What company? Silence. What revenue? He looked away. What products? Nothing. There was no answer. Because there had never been one. Kendra nodded slowly. I thought so. She reached into her evening purse. Jason frowned. What are you doing? Without answering, she removed her wedding ring. The diamond caught the warm hallway light for one final moment. Then she held it between two fingers. I spent years authenticating priceless works of art. Her eyes never left Jason's. I can't believe I failed to recognize the biggest counterfeit of my entire career. She dropped the ring. It struck the polished hardwood floor with a sharp metallic click before rolling to Jason's expensive Italian shoes. Neither of them moved. The tiny sound seemed impossibly loud. The marriage had effectively ended before either lawyer had drafted a single document. Downstairs, the party continued completely unaware. Champagne glasses clinked. The string quartet played another elegant movement. Guests laughed at stories. Luxury and sophistication continued exactly as before. Only the three people standing in the upstairs hallway understood that everything had already begun collapsing. Meanwhile, I remained downstairs, quietly moving through conversations as though I belonged there. No one questioned my presence. In rooms filled with wealthy people, confidence was often accepted as proof of importance. I listened politely, smiled when appropriate, accepted another glass of champagne, all while keeping one eye on the grand staircase. Then I saw her. Kendra. She appeared at the top of the stairs alone. She no longer looked like the poised hostess who had welcomed guests only an hour earlier. Something fundamental had changed. Her shoulders were rigid, her breathing uneven. The warmth had completely disappeared from her expression. She descended each marble step with slow, measured precision. Jason didn't follow. Neither did Brenda. Interesting. Very interesting. Kendra crossed the crowded room without acknowledging anyone. Several guests attempted to stop her for conversation. She barely noticed. Finally, she reached me. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked, "How long?" I tilted my head slightly. "How long what? How long have you known?" I held her gaze. "For years." She closed her eyes. "And everything you told me?" I nodded once. Every word. She inhaled slowly before asking the question she had been avoiding since the airport. "Is there any way out?" I answered honestly. That depends. On what? On whether the federal agents believe you were deceived, or whether they believe you became part of the scheme after discovering the truth. Fear flashed across her face. They'll investigate everything. Yes. My bank accounts? Yes. My business? Yes. My communications? Almost certainly. She looked toward the enormous living room where Jason laughed loudly with another group of wealthy guests. For the first time that evening, she wasn't looking at her husband. She was looking at a man capable of destroying everything she had built. She whispered almost to herself, "I have to get out." I gave a slight nod. "If that's your decision?" I glanced toward Jason across the room. "I wouldn't wait very long." At that exact moment, someone rang the front doorbell. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion with surprising clarity. At first, no one paid much attention. One of the catering staff moved toward the entrance, assuming another guest had arrived. Soft conversations continued. Champagne glasses clinked together. The string quartet never missed a note. Jason laughed loudly at one of his own stories, completely oblivious to the fact that his world was already beginning to unravel. I watched the front entrance without saying a word. Kendra did the same. Something in her expression told me she already knew. This wasn't another guest. The front doors opened. A uniformed valet exchanged a few quiet words with someone standing outside before quickly stepping aside. Seconds later, several men and women entered the foyer. Dark suits, professional posture, expressionless faces. No one needed to announce who they were. The room seemed to grow noticeably quieter. One of the guests frowned. Another stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Conversations gradually faded until only the music remained. Jason finally noticed the unusual silence. He turned toward the entrance, still holding his crystal glass. His confident smile disappeared. Leading the group was a middle-aged man carrying a leather credential wallet. He calmly opened it. "Good evening." His voice carried effortlessly across the room. "I'm Special Agent Michael Harris with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Beside him, another official stepped forward. "Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division." Several guests exchanged confused glances. Someone quietly whispered, "What's going on?" The lead agent continued without raising his voice. "We're here to execute federal search and seizure warrants related to an ongoing financial investigation." Every eye in the room shifted toward Jason. He forced an awkward laugh. "There must be some mistake." Nobody answered. The IRS investigator unfolded several official documents. "Jason." He confirmed Jason's full legal name. "Yes?" "We have probable cause establishing your involvement in interstate wire fraud, money laundering, possession of stolen federal funds, conspiracy, and related financial crimes." The crystal tumbler slipped from Jason's hand. It shattered against the imported marble floor. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the faint sound of breaking glass echoed through the enormous room. Brenda immediately rushed forward. "This is ridiculous." She pointed angrily toward the investigators. "My son hasn't done anything wrong." The FBI agent calmly looked at her. "Ma'am." He checked another page. "Brenda." He spoke her full legal name. "We also have evidence connecting you to unauthorized access of a federally protected escrow account, identity theft, electronic signature fraud, and conspiracy." Her expression froze. "You can't prove that." The IRS investigator quietly opened a thick evidence folder. "We recovered server authentication logs." He turned another page. "Device identification records." Another page. "Geolocation data." Another. "Wire transfer documentation." Then he looked directly at her. "And a complete forensic trail showing the transaction originated from your personal tablet while you were located in Malibu." Brenda's face turned ghostly white. She instinctively looked toward Jason. For the first time that evening, neither of them had anything to say. Around the room, guests slowly began stepping away from the family. No one wanted to be standing too close anymore. Several collectors quietly placed their champagne glasses onto nearby tables. Others discreetly reached for their phones. One investor quietly whispered, "We should leave." Within moments, the glamorous celebration transformed into a room full of frightened spectators. Jason finally found his voice. "This is Riley." He pointed directly at me. "She set this up." Every head turned toward me. I remained perfectly calm. "I warned you." My voice was neither angry nor triumphant, simply factual. "I warned every one of you exactly 1 month ago." Jason took an aggressive step forward. "You manipulated everything." "No." I shook my head. "You signed the declaration voluntarily." The FBI agent immediately looked toward Jason. "You signed a document acknowledging receipt of the disputed assets?" Jason hesitated. "Yes." The agent slowly nodded. "Thank you." He made a brief note. Jason realized what he had just admitted. His shoulders dropped. The arrogance disappeared completely. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not because he had physically changed, but because the illusion surrounding him had finally collapsed. The confident CEO was gone. Only a frightened man drowning in his own lies remained. The lead investigator addressed the room. "This property is now subject to federal seizure proceedings." He turned toward the catering manager. "The event is over." Guests quietly began collecting their coats. No one complained. No one argued. Within minutes, the mansion that had been overflowing with laughter and expensive conversation became almost silent. Luxury cars slowly disappeared from the driveway. The musicians packed away their instruments. Waiters carried untouched trays back toward the kitchen. The celebration ended not with applause, but with paperwork. Kendra stood alone near the staircase, watching everything unfold. She slowly removed her wedding bracelet, then her diamond earrings. Finally, she looked directly at me. "You were right." There was no anger left in her voice, only exhaustion. "I wish you hadn't been." I gave a small nod. "So do I." Outside, flashing red and blue lights reflected across the polished windows of the mansion. The illusion was finally over. The truth no longer needed anyone to explain it. It was standing in the driveway for everyone to see. The flashing emergency lights painted shifting bands of red and blue across the marble walls, washing away every trace of glamour that had filled the mansion only minutes earlier. The illusion had finally collapsed. Guests who had once admired Jason's supposed success now hurried toward the exits without so much as a goodbye. Expensive conversations about investment opportunities and exclusive art collections had been replaced by hushed whispers and nervous glances. No one wanted to be associated with what had just become the center of a federal criminal investigation. Outside, additional government vehicles rolled quietly into the driveway. Inside, FBI agents and IRS investigators moved with calm, practiced efficiency. There was no shouting, no unnecessary drama, only procedures. Photographs were taken. Evidence tags appeared. Every room was documented. Every computer, folder, and financial record was carefully cataloged. To the investigators, this wasn't an emotional family dispute. It was simply another financial crime scene. Jason remained standing exactly where the agents had questioned him. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked like an empty costume. The confidence that had defined him all evening had completely vanished. He looked toward me one final time. "I never thought you'd actually do it." His voice sounded strangely hollow. I met his eyes. "I never wanted it to end this way." For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then I continued. "But every chance you were given, you used to hurt someone else. You stole. You lied. You manipulated everyone who cared about you. And when you had the opportunity to stop, you chose to sign. Jason lowered his head. There was nothing left to argue. Every lie had already been disproven. Every excuse had expired. Brenda suddenly began crying, not quiet tears. Loud, desperate sobs. She reached toward Jason as agents instructed them to remain separated. "This is all her fault," she shouted, pointing directly at me. "She betrayed her own family." Several nearby guests looked at her with open disbelief. One older collector quietly shook his head. "No," he murmured. "They betrayed themselves." His words carried farther than he intended. Brenda heard them. So did everyone else. For the first time that evening, not a single person came to her defense. Thomas stood silently near the fireplace, staring at the floor. The proud patriarch who had spent the evening boasting about his successful son looked decades older. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply watched the consequences of years of favoritism unfold in front of him. Kendra slowly approached one of the federal agents. Her attorney's business card was already in her hand. "I'd like to cooperate fully," she said. "I have information and documents that may assist your investigation." The agent nodded professionally. "We'll arrange an interview." She glanced toward Jason. There was no love left in her expression, only disappointment. "I was deceived," she said quietly. "And I'd like to make sure the record reflects that." Jason closed his eyes. He understood exactly what those words meant. She had chosen survival. She was no longer his wife. She was now a cooperating witness. Outside, a tow truck slowly backed into the driveway. Luxury vehicles purchased with stolen funds would soon become government property. Inside, another team began attaching inventory labels to valuable artwork and expensive furnishings. The mansion that had represented Jason's greatest achievement had become little more than an evidence warehouse. I quietly walked toward the front entrance. No one stopped me. No one had any reason to. As I reached the doorway, I paused for one last look. Only a month earlier, my family had laughed at me. They had mocked my career. They had dismissed every warning I gave them. They believed integrity was weakness and deception was intelligence. Tonight, they finally learned the difference. Justice is rarely dramatic. It doesn't arrive with revenge. It arrives with documentation, with signatures, with transaction records, with evidence. And once the truth is thoroughly documented, it no longer needs anyone to defend it. I stepped outside into the cool California night. Behind me, investigators continued their work beneath the flashing lights. Ahead of me, the city stretched into the distance. For the first time in years, I felt no anger, no satisfaction, only peace. Because this had never been about destroying my family. It had been about refusing to let them destroy me. Without looking back again, I walked toward my car. The door closed softly behind me. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the mansion and everything it represented behind forever. Brenda's tone turned venomous as she fired back. "We're the ones who brought you into this family. We gave you access to a beautiful home and a lavish lifestyle you never could have had on your own. You should be thanking Jason instead of attacking him in the hallway like some hysterical woman. You have plenty of rich clients, Kendra. If the bank comes asking for the money back, just sell a few more paintings and cover the difference. It's not that complicated." That was the final piece of the puzzle, and it clicked into place with a sickening finality. Kendra's eyes darted between Jason and Brenda as the truth settled over her like cold water. The whole family was in on it. They had targeted her specifically. They'd known exactly what she was. A successful luxury art broker with deep high society connections and an impeccable credit history. They had never actually wanted her as family. What they wanted was a financial safety net. Someone to catch them once Riley's accounts finally ran dry. She was the mark. Plain and simple. The ultimate score. "I'm leaving," Kendra said, her voice going completely hollow. I'm going to walk down those stairs, call my lawyer, and file for an immediate annulment. Then I'm going straight to the police. I am not going down with the rest of you. She turned on her heel and took a single step toward the staircase, but Jason was faster. Panic overtook every feature of his face at once. If Kendra walked out of that house tonight, in front of all those wealthy investors, his entire facade would shatter beyond repair. He lunged and seized her upper arm, his grip bruising, desperate, far too tight. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, yanking her back from the stairs. He leaned in close enough that his breath was hot against her ear. "Half the people down there are your clients, Kendra. If you go running out of here crying and the feds show up right after, you'll look every bit as guilty as I am. You signed the marriage license. We're in this together whether you like it or not." Kendra tried to wrench her arm free, but Jason was far stronger than her, and he locked his fingers around her wrist like a vice, pasting a terrifyingly convincing smile onto his face. "Now," he said through clenched teeth, "we are going to walk down those stairs hand in hand. You are going to smile at your rich little friends. You are going to play the perfect happy wife. Because if I go to prison, Kendra, I swear to you, I will drag your spotless reputation down into the mud right along with me." She looked into his eyes and saw nothing there but the cold, desperate calculation of a cornered animal. So she stopped fighting. She let him pull her forward and used her one free, trembling hand to smooth the front of her emerald gown. Together they descended the grand staircase, walking back into a party built entirely on lies, with no idea that the real authorities were already en route. By the time Jason and Kendra reappeared at the base of the staircase, his fingers were wrapped so tightly around her waist that his knuckles had gone white beneath the glare of the crystal chandelier. He flagged down a passing waiter and snatched a fresh glass of champagne almost violently. A heavy sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, and the underarms of his tailored jacket had begun to look damp. He was a trapped man doing his very best impression of a king. He picked up a silver spoon and struck it sharply against his crystal glass. The high, ringing note cut through the room, and the string quartet fell silent almost instantly. A room full of millionaires turned toward the staircase. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," Jason announced, his voice booming with forced confidence. "I want to personally welcome all of you into our beautiful new home. It's been an absolutely incredible month. My firm just closed our best quarter yet, and I get to share this magnificent estate with my stunning new wife, Kendra." His gaze swept across the crowd of investors and gallery owners until it landed on me, standing quietly near the patio doors at the back of the room. Something desperate and calculating flickered across his face. He needed to assert control. He needed to get ahead of the money story, just in case Kendra decided to talk to her high society friends later. "You know," Jason went on, taking a bold step forward and pointing his glass directly at me, "building an empire like this takes a village. And tonight, I actually want to raise a glass to someone very special standing right over there, my older sister Riley." The whole room turned to look at me in my sharply tailored charcoal suit. Jason's smile widened, though his eyes stayed cold, frantic beneath the surface. "Riley's a number cruncher," he told the crowd, his tone dripping with condescending pity. "She works long hours in a little cubicle downtown. She doesn't get out much. Honestly, she's always been a bit of a loner, someone who struggles to socialize. But when I told her I was buying this house in Calabasas for my new bride, Riley insisted on helping out." He took a slow, theatrical sip of champagne, letting the insult sink in. "She practically drained her whole savings account to make a generous contribution toward our down payment. I told her no, of course, but she wouldn't hear it. I think when you live a quiet life like that, all alone, you want to feel like you're part of something bigger. You want to live vicariously through somebody else's success. So, thank you, Riley. my hardworking, lonely sister for buying a small piece of our dream tonight. The room offered a round of polite, deeply uncomfortable applause. A few of the wealthy art collectors gave me looks of genuine pity, having swallowed his story whole, that I was some sad, aging spinster who'd handed over her life savings just to buy a scrap of affection from her successful younger brother. My mother beamed with radiant pride, raising her wineglass high, fully endorsing Jason's humiliating little narrative. My father let out a booming laugh and clapped the shoulder of the investor beside him. They were thrilled by my public humiliation. This was their favorite fantasy playing out live, putting me in my place while lifting the golden child onto his pedestal. But Kendra wasn't smiling at all. She stood frozen beside Jason, her face ashen, drained of all life, watching a room full of her own elite clients applaud what amounted to a federal crime. Then her eyes found mine, and they were screaming in silent terror. She knew every word out of Jason's mouth was a lie of catastrophic proportions. I didn't blush. I didn't look away or bow my head in shame. I stood perfectly still, glass of champagne in hand. Jason thought he'd humiliated me. He thought this little speech would send me out the door in tears. He had no idea that his arrogant toast was the single greatest gift he could have handed a forensic accountant. In his desperate scramble to control the narrative and stroke his own fragile ego, he'd just handed dozens of wealthy witnesses a verbal confession, publicly acknowledging receipt of the exact funds the federal government was already tracking. I raised my glass slightly in his direction and let a serene, unbothered smile settle onto my face. Let him enjoy the applause. Let him savor the taste of expensive champagne. It would be the very last moment of triumph he'd ever get to experience. The scattered applause faded into the low hum of the estate. Jason stood at the base of the stairs, chest puffed out, thoroughly convinced his little display had silenced me for good. A few guests near the patio doors shot me sympathetic looks, fully bought into the fabricated portrait of the pathetic spinster sister. I didn't shrink from their pity. Instead, I stepped away from the glass doors and walked straight into the center of the room. The crowd parted for me, probably expecting a tearful exit or a meek apology. I offered neither. I stopped in the middle of the Persian rug, holding my champagne flute perfectly level. "I'm not one for public speaking," I began, my voice clear and steady, cutting easily through the murmurs. "But since my brother has decided to make financial disclosures part of tonight's festivities, I think it's only fair that his accounting be accurate." Jason's smug smile faltered. He shifted his weight, his grip tightening on Kendra's waist. My father took a sudden step forward from the bar, his face flushing red, but the room was already captivated. Wealthy people are drawn to confidence like moths to a flame, and I was radiating the calm authority of someone holding every card in the deck. I looked around at the faces of Kendra's clients, the gallery owners, the private investors. "Jason is incredibly creative," I continued smoothly. "He's always had a real gift for storytelling, but I'm afraid I can't take credit for the generous contribution he just mentioned." Confused looks passed through the crowd. "I wish I could say my life savings paid for this beautiful marble floor," I said, lifting my glass in a mock toast. "But I can't, because the $240,000 used to secure the down payment on this house doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the United States federal government." The reaction was instant and electric. The wealthy elite fear very little, but they share one universal primal terror: the IRS and the federal government. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Guests stopped mid-sip. Several investors physically stepped back from Jason, as though he'd suddenly come down with something contagious. Whispers turned harsh and urgent. Jason's skin went the color of old parchment, the sweat on his forehead turning ice cold in an instant. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, pathetic croak came out. His hands dropped from Kendra's waist as the weight of what I'd just said crashed down on him. My mother let out a sharp, indignant squawk, nearly spilling her wine. "Riley, stop this nonsense right now," she demanded, her voice shrill. "You're embarrassing your brother in front of his friends." "I'm simply clarifying the public record, Mom," I replied, never breaking eye contact with Jason. "You see? Everyone here was just told I'm a lonely bookkeeper. That's another one of Jason's creative little stories. I'm a corporate forensic accountant. I manage federal tax escrow accounts for enterprise clients. The money Jason used to buy this house was an unauthorized wire transfer, pulled straight from a federal holding account under my jurisdiction." Panic swept through the room. An older man holding a Scotch glass, one of the investors Jason had spent all night courting, set his drink down hard on a side table. "Are you saying this house was bought with stolen federal funds?" he demanded, his voice thick with fury. Jason scrambled, hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. No, this is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking. "She's lying. She's jealous. It was a family loan. I have the paperwork." "Yes, you do have the paperwork," I agreed pleasantly. "You signed a legally binding declaration of receipt yesterday morning in a coffee shop. That document, along with the forged digital authorization logs and the interstate wire routing numbers, was transmitted securely to federal authorities exactly 36 hours ago." Jason stared at me, eyes wide with horrified realization. The paper he'd so arrogantly signed wasn't a tax shield after all. It was a fully documented confession. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had buried him completely. He was a cornered man standing in the middle of a fraud that was about to be exposed to the entire world. He stared at me for 3 long seconds before his shock curdled into rage. The color drained from his face, replaced by an angry flush of crimson. He crossed the distance between us in 2 strides, snatched the champagne flute from my hand, and hurled it onto the Persian rug, where it shattered. "She's insane!" Jason shouted, spinning to face the crowd, his voice cracking with panic and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Don't listen to a word this lunatic says. She's having some kind of psychotic break. She's been jealous of me my entire life, and now she's trying to ruin my party with these delusions." The guests didn't look convinced. A few private equity investors were already edging discreetly toward the coat check. Sensing the illusion collapsing, my mother rushed to Jason's defense. "Security!" Brenda shrieked, waving frantically at the valet staff. "Grab her and get her out of this house right now. My daughter is mentally unwell. She forgot her medication today. Someone call the police and have her removed before she hurts somebody." I didn't move an inch. I looked at the shattered crystal on the rug, then up at my brother. "You don't need to call the police, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the hysteria with chilling calm. "I already took care of that call for you." Jason took another step toward me, hands balled into fists. "You're bluffing," he hissed, breath hot with effort as he tried to intimidate me. "You're bluffing because you're a pathetic woman who can't stand watching me win. There's no federal investigation. There's no wire fraud, no stolen tax money. I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, and you're just a bitter accountant trying to steal my spotlight." He raised his arm. A trembling finger pointed between my eyes, ready to launch into another round of lies for the crowd. But the words never made it out of his throat because, at that exact moment, the lighting in the room shifted violently. The soft glow of the chandelier was swallowed by a blinding glare from outside. Sharp bursts of red and blue slicing through the darkness of the Calabasas night, pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows and painting Jason's terrified face in alternating flashes of crimson and blue. Then came the sound. Not the smooth purr of luxury sedans dropping off guests, but the aggressive roar of tactical engines accelerating hard. The elite crowd gasped as one and scrambled backward from the glass, spilling champagne across their designer clothes. Tires screeched as multiple vehicles cut off the paved driveway entirely, and I heard the sickening crunch of heavy metal tearing through the manicured lawn, flattening my mother's prized rose bushes into the dirt. 4 massive black tactical SUVs slammed to a halt in front of the porch, boxing in the sports cars already parked there. Doors flew open in perfect unison, and the thud of combat boots on pavement carried clearly through the glass. Inside, chaos erupted. The musicians abandoned their instruments on the floor and shrank against the dining room wall. Kendra let out a high whimper and stumbled backward until her spine hit the bar, clutching the fabric of her gown, eyes wide with horror as she stared out the windows. She knew exactly what those lights meant. Her career, her reputation, her freedom. All of it was suddenly sitting in the crosshairs of a federal raid. Jason stood frozen in the middle of the rug, arms still raised uselessly in my direction, his hand shaking so violently he looked like he was having a medical episode. He slowly lowered it, jaw dropping open as he turned toward the front entryway. The terrified silence inside the house was shattered by a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A brutal, thunderous pounding on the custom oak doors. Not a neighborly knock. The heavy, authoritative pounding of federal agents demanding entry, announcing the absolute end of Jason's stolen little empire. Before anyone could even draw a breath, the oak doors were forced open with a crack that splintered the frame, and a flood of armed agents poured into the foyer, boots striking the marble like a military drumbeat. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, fanning out to secure every exit. The bold yellow letters across the backs of their windbreakers confirmed my brother's worst nightmare. FBI. IRS Criminal Investigation. These weren't local officers responding to a noise complaint. They looked like a force built specifically to dismantle arrogant white-collar criminals. I took a slow step back, easing myself out of the center of the rug and into the shadows near the patio doors. I set my empty flute down on a console table and brushed an invisible speck of dust off my lapel. I'd spent weeks quietly building the trail that led these agents to this exact address, and I intended to watch the final act unfold without breaking a sweat. I had no interest in getting in the way of a federal warrant being executed. A tall man with close-cropped gray hair stepped forward from the formation, holding up a thick folder bearing the seal of a federal judge. His voice boomed through the silent room. "Federal agents," he announced, making sure every person in the house heard him. "We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant for this property, registered to Jason Corporate LLC. We also have active arrest warrants for Jason and Brenda on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Anyone who does not live here, set your drinks down, leave your belongings where they are, and proceed to the front door for identification." That single command hit the crowd like a starter pistol. The sheer terror of being connected to a high-profile federal raid instantly overrode any loyalty they might have felt toward Kendra. These were people whose entire livelihoods depended on spotless reputations. The thought of a subpoena, or a photograph of them fleeing a raided mansion, was completely unthinkable. The elegant housewarming dissolved into a stampede. People who prided themselves on composure shoved past one another, desperate to escape the blast radius of Jason's crimes, knowing full well federal investigations behave like black holes, pulling in anyone who lingers too close. Champagne flutes slipped from trembling hands and shattered against the marble, soaking the rugs. The string quartet abandoned their instruments against the wall and sprinted for the door. The investors who'd been slapping Jason on the back minutes earlier now shoved toward the exit, ignoring his desperate pleas to wait. Kendra's clients hiked up their gowns and hurried out, shielding their faces with clutches as though paparazzi were already waiting. Jason grabbed the sleeve of a real estate developer he'd spent the whole night courting. "Please," he begged, voice cracking, "tell them I'm legitimate. Tell them about the startup. The man yanked his arm free, shot Jason a look of pure disgust, and bolted through the shattered doorway. Kendra stood frozen by the bar, watching her entire professional network vanish in under a minute. She tried to catch the eye of a gallery owner she'd mentored, but the woman looked straight through her without a word. Within 3 minutes, the room was empty of guests. The only people left in the wreckage were my brother, my mother, my father, and Kendra, stripped of their audience, exposed entirely to the unforgiving weight of federal law. The lead agent gave a sharp nod, and 4 agents stepped forward with steel handcuffs already in hand. The illusion of the Golden family was officially over. 2 agents advanced on my mother first. Brenda staggered backward, holding up her hands as though she could physically wave off the federal government. "You cannot do this," she shrieked. "I'm a respected member of this community. I'm a mother. There's been a terrible mistake. I'm completely innocent." The taller agent didn't blink. He caught her wrist, twisted her arm behind her back, and the cuffs snapped shut with a sharp metallic click as she screamed in genuine shock. "Brenda Wilson," he stated flatly, "you're under arrest for federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. I'd strongly suggest using it." My mother dissolved into hysterics, her styled hair falling loose as she sobbed, reduced in an instant from society matriarch to common criminal complaining about her tight bracelets. Jason watched his mother get cuffed, eyes bulging with pure terror, as the reality of a federal prison sentence finally cracked through his delusions. And instead of facing it, the Golden Child did the one thing he'd always done when things got hard. He ran. He spun and sprinted toward the open patio doors just a few feet from where I stood in the shadows, knocking over a side table and sending a floral arrangement crashing to the floor. "Jason, stop right there!" a tactical agent shouted, drawing a taser and breaking into a dead sprint after him. Jason burst onto the stone patio, running blindly toward the edge of the yard, maybe imagining he could vanish into the dark hills beyond. But he was wearing dress shoes with smooth soles, and as he reached the glowing infinity pool, his foot lost traction entirely on the damp stone. He flailed wildly, trying to catch his balance, but the agent chasing him didn't hesitate. He launched forward, wrapping both arms around Jason's waist, and the momentum carried them both straight over the edge. With a massive splash, my brother and the agent plunged into the deep end of the illuminated pool. A second later, Jason surfaced, gasping, his perfectly styled hair plastered flat, his ruined blazer dragging him down like an anchor. The agent, unbothered by the cold water, shoved him toward the shallow steps. "Move," he ordered, hauling Jason out by the collar. Jason crawled onto the wet stone, coughing up chlorinated water and shivering. The agent forced his face down against the concrete and cuffed him. "Jason Wilson, you're under federal arrest for money laundering and asset concealment." Inside, my father watched his legacy collapse in real time. Thomas stood frozen near the bar, mouth hanging open, all the color draining from his face as he watched his only son dragged across the patio, soaked and handcuffed. He let out a strange, strangled sound and grabbed at his chest, his knees buckling beneath him as he collapsed onto the white leather sofa. An agent rushed to check his pulse and radio for medical help. It wasn't a heart attack, just a full-blown panic attack as his entire world came apart around him. Kendra stood by the broken glass, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the wreckage of her short marriage. I stayed exactly where I was, watching it all unfold with total detachment. My mother's shrieks, my brother's shivering, my father's ragged breathing. It filled the room. It was over. But the federal government wasn't quite finished yet. While my family stood paralyzed in shock, the rest of the tactical team moved on to their second objective with brutal efficiency. Agents carrying rolls of orange and green tape spread through the first floor, slapping federal seizure notices across the mahogany walls, the marble countertops, the glass doors. each one stamped with the seal of the Department of Justice, legally branding the estate as confiscated government property. Kendra watched the systematic dismantling of her new life in silence until an agent in tactical gloves walked toward the formal dining room and reached for a modern abstract painting hanging above the buffet show, a multi-million-dollar canvas she'd been actively brokering for a European client. He began lifting it off the wall hooks. "Wait!" Kendra shouted, breaking her frozen stance and rushing forward, her gown dragging across the wet marble. "You can't touch that. That painting doesn't belong to Jason. It's part of my professional inventory. I'm a licensed art broker, and that canvas is on loan from a gallery in London. It has nothing to do with this house or his accounts." The lead agent stepped directly into her path. "Are you Kendra Wilson, the legal wife of the primary suspect?" he asked. "Yes," she stammered, wrapping her arms around herself. "But my business is entirely separate. My finances are completely isolated from his. I had no idea about the stolen funds. Please, leave my inventory alone. If you seize that painting, my career is over. I'll be sued into bankruptcy." The agent didn't flinch. "Ignorance of the crime doesn't grant you immunity from its consequences, Mrs. Wilson. Under federal civil asset forfeiture statutes, high-value items stored inside a property purchased with illicit funds are subject to immediate seizure. Your husband used stolen federal tax dollars to buy the roof over your head. The government now considers your art inventory a commingled asset and a potential instrument of money laundering." Kendra gasped and stumbled back as though she'd been struck. The agent finished unhooking the painting, wrapped it in protective plastic, and carried it out through the shattered front door. Another team was already tagging antique sculptures and vases in the sitting room. Piece by piece, her professional credibility was being loaded into government trucks. "You're stripping my entire life away," Kendra whispered, tears finally spilling down her perfectly done cheeks. "I have nothing to do with his crimes. I'm a victim here." "You're the spouse of an indicted federal criminal," the agent corrected. "We're freezing your personal accounts and seizing your business licenses pending a full forensic audit of your marital assets. If you want to prove your innocence, hire a defense attorney immediately. Right now, this property and everything in it belongs to the IRS." He turned from her to address the whole room, my father still gasping on the sofa, my mother handcuffed and sobbing in a dining chair. "Listen up," he announced, his voice final. "The warrant covers immediate seizure of this estate and everything within its property lines. That includes the vehicles in the driveway, the jewelry in the safes, and every piece of furniture in this house. You have 10 minutes to gather your coats and whatever identification you're carrying. After that, anyone not in handcuffs will be escorted off the premises. You're officially evicted." Kendra looked around the massive room, eyes wide with total despair. She'd walked into this house tonight like a queen. Now she had nothing. The 10 minutes evaporated in a blur of frantic movement and humiliation. The agents offered no extensions. When the deadline hit, they physically moved the remaining occupants toward the entryway. I walked out on my own, hands resting in my pockets. The cool Calabasas air was a sharp contrast to the panic still churning inside the house. The driveway had become a chaotic scene, lit up by strobing red and blue light. Neighbors had spilled out onto their lawns, filming the spectacular collapse of Jason Corporate LLC. My brother stood near the back of a black SUV, still dripping and shivering, hands cuffed behind his back, with an agent standing close guard. My mother was loaded into a separate cruiser, mascara running in dark streaks down her face. Paramedics had arrived for my father and were helping him into an ambulance to monitor the aftermath of his panic attack. Then Kendra came out. She'd managed to grab her trench coat, wrapped tightly over her gown, carrying nothing but a small clutch with her ID inside. Every piece of jewelry, every designer shoe, every asset she'd brought into that marriage stayed locked inside the crime scene behind her. She walked down the front steps, heels clicking against the concrete, and when she saw the neighbors filming, whatever restraint she had left broke completely. She marched toward the vehicle where Jason stood. The guarding agent stepped forward to intercept her, but she ignored him entirely, eyes fixed on the man who'd ruined her. Jason looked up at her, teeth chattering, hair plastered to his skull, looking utterly pathetic. "Kendra," he stammered, "babe, please, call my lawyer. Tell him it's a misunderstanding. Tell him to post bail. I can fix this. I promise, I can fix this." Kendra said nothing at first. She simply stared, chest heaving with disgust and fury. Then she raised her left hand, grabbed the 5-carat diamond ring he'd proposed with, the ring she'd flaunted proudly to every one of her elite clients, and yanked it off her finger. "You can't fix anything, you pathetic fraud!" she screamed, her voice echoing down the street, and hurled the ring straight at his face. It struck him hard on the cheekbone before bouncing off and clattering uselessly onto the driveway. "You stole my reputation. You stole my future. Don't you ever contact me again. I'm filing for an annulment tomorrow morning, and I hope they lock you up for the rest of your miserable life." Jason flinched away as the ring struck him, unable even to raise his hands to protect himself. He just stood there crying while Kendra tore him apart in front of the agents and the entire neighborhood. Then she spun around, chest still heaving, and her eyes landed on me, standing near the edge of the property, watching the whole thing with total calm. The anger in her expression collapsed instantly into frantic, desperate fear. She rushed toward me and grabbed my forearm. "Riley, please," she begged, voice dropping to a whisper. "You know I had nothing to do with this. You're a forensic accountant. You have all the data. You can trace the funds and prove my business accounts were completely separate from his laundering. Please, I'll pay whatever your firm charges. I'll do anything. You have to help me detach my name from his crimes before the government takes my gallery too." I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve and felt nothing. No pity for the woman who'd mocked my clothes and encouraged my brother to spend stolen money without a second thought. I gently but firmly pulled my arm free and stepped back. "You told me once to stop hoarding pennies," I said, my voice flat and cold. "Start hoarding yours, Kendra. You're going to need them for a defense attorney." I turned my back on her and walked to my car, leaving her alone in the driveway. A full week passed since those red and blue lights lit up the Calabasas driveway. The dust had settled, but the devastation remained total. I sat at my glass desk in my downtown Los Angeles office, reviewing an unrelated corporate audit while the morning sun cut long geometric shadows across the white carpet. My surroundings were the picture of stability and control. The noise of my family was entirely absent. My lawyer had already told me that Jason and my mother had been denied bail, given the scale of the stolen funds and the obvious flight risk, both currently sitting in federal holding cells, waiting for arraignment. My office phone rang, an unfamiliar local number, but instinct told me exactly who it was. I let it ring 4 times before calmly pressing speaker. "Hello?" I said, my voice level. "Riley," came a broken gasp. It was my father, though he sounded nothing like the arrogant patriarch who'd grabbed my arm in the foyer a week earlier. He sounded old, fragile, entirely shattered, hyperventilating between violent sobs. "Riley, please don't hang up. You have to listen to me, I'm begging you." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm listening, Thomas," I replied, deliberately using his first name to mark the permanent end of whatever bond we'd once had. He let out a wet, pitiful sob. "I just got back from the detention center. I had to talk to your mother through a pane of reinforced glass. She's wearing an orange jumpsuit, Riley. They're treating her like a criminal. And Jason? He looks terrified. The other inmates are giving him a hard time. He's just a boy. He doesn't belong in a place like that." "Jason is 30 years old," I corrected smoothly. He's a grown man who made a conscious decision to steal $250,000 from the United States government. It was a mistake, Thomas wailed. A stupid mistake to impress that awful woman he married. But they're your family, Riley. Your own blood. You've made your point. You've won. Now please, call the agents and tell them to drop the charges. Tell them it was a misunderstanding, that you authorized the transfer and will pay the government back over time. The sheer delusion in that request was staggering. My father genuinely believed a massive federal indictment was some kind of family squabble that could be erased with one phone call, as though the FBI operated like a neighborhood homeowners association. I can't drop the charges, I explained, as though speaking to a child. I'm not the plaintiff, Thomas. The Department of Justice is the plaintiff. I'm just the forensic accountant who handed them the proof. The machine is already moving. I couldn't stop it even if I wanted to. You're not even trying, he screamed, his begging curdling into aggressive manipulation. You always hated Jason. You were always jealous of the attention we gave him. We gave you a roof over your head, food on the table, our family name. And this is how you repay us? You're destroying our bloodline, Riley. Wiping out our legacy because you're a bitter, vindictive spinster. I let him hurl every insult stored in his arsenal. I listened to the gasping panic of a man realizing his golden child was never going to save him. If Jason goes to federal prison, this family is dead, he sobbed, his anger collapsing back into despair. I'll lose everything. The legal fees are already draining my retirement. I'm going to have to sell the house. You're ruining my life, Riley. You're sending your own mother to a cell. How do you sleep at night knowing you did this to your own family? His words were designed to pierce decades of conditioned guilt. But sitting in my quiet office, looking out over the city skyline, I felt nothing. The manipulation that had controlled me for 33 years had lost every ounce of its power. He was mourning a legacy that had never truly existed, one built entirely on lies, theft, and my own silent suffering. Thomas gasped for air, his ragged breathing filling the line. I let the silence stretch. Let him sit in the empty space where my apologies used to live. For my entire life, that silence had been my cue to grovel, to rush in, absorb his anger, and offer up whatever resources were needed to clean up Jason's latest disaster. Today, the silence just hung there, cold and heavy. I'm not destroying this family, Thomas, I finally said, my voice dropping low and steady. This family destroyed itself the moment you decided my bank accounts were a free pass for your favorite son. You didn't provide for me. I provided for myself, despite the constant financial and emotional drain the three of you placed on my life. You demanded I subsidize a lifestyle you couldn't afford, and when I finally closed the vault, you resorted to federal theft instead. He tried to interrupt, his voice pitching upward, but I cut him off. Don't speak, I said, and the authority in my voice silenced him instantly. You're going to listen now. You're crying about your legal fees and your retirement accounts, but you never once thought about the 10 years in federal prison I could have faced if the IRS believed I was complicit in that wire fraud. You were perfectly willing to let me take the fall so Jason could have his mansion and his fake tech empire. You were ready to sacrifice my freedom on the altar of his fragile ego. But he's your brother, Thomas whimpered, all the fight draining out of him, leaving nothing but a broken old man. Blood doesn't forge digital signatures to steal $250,000, I shot back. Blood doesn't parade a stolen house in front of high society while mocking the person who actually earned the money. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass of my desk, wanting my next words to sear themselves permanently into his memory, to echo through his empty house for the rest of his life. I didn't press charges, Dad. The federal government did. You enabled a thief because you loved the golden child more than the truth. You built an entire fantasy world, and now the bill has finally come due. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, One last desperate attempt at an excuse, at mercy. "Enjoy the ashes," I said, and pressed the red button. The dial tone hummed for a split second before the line went dead. I picked up my personal phone, opened the carrier settings, and manually entered my father's number into the blocked contacts list. Then my mother's. Then Jason's. Then the numbers for the Malibu rental, the country club, the local bail bondsman. I severed every digital and telephonic connection to my former family, one by one. There would be no tearful reunion in a prison visitation room. No dramatic reconciliation, no toxic forgiveness. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was vaporized entirely. I'd comply with any subpoena that required my testimony, but outside the witness stand, I was completely, permanently done. I sat back and took a slow breath. For the first time in 33 years, my chest felt light. The crushing weight of their expectations, their entitlement, their endless belittling was simply gone. I looked around my pristine office, a life I had built entirely with my own two hands, my title, my credit score, my financial independence earned through sheer grit and unmatched competence. Outside, the city of Los Angeles hummed on, millions of people going about their day, entirely unaware of the federal implosion that had just occurred in Calabasas. Jason was going to face a ruthless judge. Brenda was going to face a jury of her peers. Kendra was going to face the ruin of her professional reputation. And Thomas was going to face the rest of his life alone, in a house he could no longer afford. They'd wanted to treat me like a mindless bank. They forgot that banks come with ruthless security protocols, and when you try to rob the vault, the steel doors lock you inside with it. I turned back to the corporate audit glowing on my monitors. I had a client meeting in 15 minutes and a multi-million-dollar merger to review. My career was accelerating fast, and my future, for the very first time, belonged entirely to me. I picked up my pen and got back to work. 6 months passed with the clean efficiency of a perfectly balanced ledger. The federal justice system moves slowly during an investigation, but once the indictments are unsealed, it comes down like a guillotine. I didn't attend the sentencing hearings in person. I simply read the official court transcripts, forwarded to my secure email by the prosecuting attorneys. There was something about the flat, sterile language of a court reporter's transcript that offered far more satisfaction than sitting in a gallery on a hard wooden bench. The collapse of Jason Corporate LLC was swift and merciless. Jason stood before an unsympathetic federal judge in a downtown courtroom, stripped of his tailored blazers and designer watches, dressed instead in the drab standard-issue uniform of a federal inmate, wrists chained to his waist. According to the transcript, he made one last attempt to charm the court. Throwing around hollow tech buzzwords about market disruption and a temporary liquidity crisis, actually trying to convince a federal judge that the stolen money had simply been early-stage venture capital. The judge cut him off mid-sentence and noted that stealing $250,000 from the IRS wasn't a disruptive business strategy. It was a felony, plain and simple. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the empty gallery. Jason was sentenced to 60 months in a federal correctional facility. 5 straight years. No early parole for white-collar crime of that scale. The arrogant golden child who had never worked a hard day in his life was now facing scheduled head counts, steel toilets, and forced labor for pennies an hour. His illusion of dominance now lived inside a concrete box. My mother avoided joining him behind bars, but her punishment turned out to be, in its own way, even more agonizing for a woman obsessed with appearances. Terrified of a federal sentence, she took a brutal plea deal, and to satisfy her probation and the court-ordered restitution, she had to liquidate absolutely everything: her retirement, her savings, the last of the equity in her home. At 60 years old, The woman who once sneered at my practical wardrobe was forced into the minimum wage workforce just to survive. A former neighbor mentioned spotting her recently, working as a cashier at a discount retail store in the San Fernando Valley, standing 8 hours a day on hard linoleum in a stiff blue polyester vest, scanning groceries and bagging cheap goods. In a strange twist of poetic justice, she frequently rings up the exact same country club women she'd spent decades trying to impress. They don't meet her eyes anymore. They just take their receipts and walk away, leaving her stuck in the prison of her own public humiliation, her aching feet a daily reminder of the crime she committed. Kendra executed her exit with the same ruthless precision I always suspected she had in her. The morning after the raid, she filed an emergency petition for annulment, citing financial fraud and criminal deception, and a judge granted it almost immediately, legally cutting her loose from Jason before the ink on his fingerprint cards had even dried. But while she escaped the criminal charges themselves, she couldn't outrun the professional fallout. The seizure of her art inventory made industry news nationwide, and in the world of elite art dealing, reputation and discretion are the only real currency. Her wealthiest clients abandoned her instantly. No one wants a broker whose name is permanently linked to a federal money laundering case. The major galleries in Los Angeles and New York blacklisted her overnight, ignoring her calls and emails entirely. Stripped of her seized inventory and her network, Kendra packed what little she could into 2 suitcases and left the country altogether. Rumor has it she resurfaced in a minor secondary market somewhere in Eastern Europe, trying to rebuild from nothing, a long way from champagne parties in Calabasas mansions, now authenticating cheap estate sale paintings in total obscurity. As for my father, he retreated into complete isolation. The legal fees bankrupted him, and he ended up renting a small, dim apartment far from the coastline he'd always loved. His grand legacy had shrunk down to a son behind bars and a wife scanning barcodes for minimum wage. The toxic dynamic that had suffocated me for over 3 decades was finally, completely extinguished. They'd gambled everything to keep a pathetic lie alive, and the house, as it always does, won. Exactly 1 year later, I stood at the head of a long, polished mahogany table in a high-rise boardroom. Outside the windows, a brutal Chicago winter howled off Lake Michigan, but inside my corner office the climate was perfectly controlled, warm and quiet. The frosted glass doors at the entrance bore my name in sleek silver lettering, Riley Corporate Forensics. I was no longer a senior associate managing accounts for someone else's firm. I was the founder and CEO of my own agency, and the enormous void left by cutting out my toxic family had become exactly the space I needed to build something of my own. Leaving Los Angeles was the smartest strategic move I ever made. The West Coast was tainted by memories of endless demands and the suffocating weight of my father's expectations. Chicago offered a clean slate, a city built on hard work and undeniable results, where substance mattered more than optics. In the past 12 months, my firm had already landed exclusive contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies. We specialized in unraveling corporate fraud, corporate espionage, and recovering stolen assets. Every time I uncovered a hidden offshore account or exposed a corrupt executive, I felt a real, deep sense of vindication. I had turned the worst betrayal of my life into a lucrative, empowering career. I was respected, feared, and, for the first time, completely untouchable. I walked to the window and looked down at the city streets below. Tiny cars moving in orderly lines, completely unaware of the complex financial ecosystems operating in the glass towers above them. In finance, there's a term for a particular kind of trap: the sunk cost fallacy. The dangerous habit of continuing to pour resources into a failing investment simply because you've already invested so much. You keep feeding a dying venture, hoping against reason that it'll suddenly turn around. For 33 years, my family was my worst sunk cost. I kept pouring in loyalty, money, and sanity, waiting for a return that was never going to come. One honest ounce of respect, one moment of unconditional love. But toxic people aren't just bad investments. They're active black holes. They don't simply fail to yield returns. They consume everything you build, given the chance. Cutting out my mother's toxicity, my father's endless enabling, and my brother's narcissism wasn't a tragedy. It was the single most profitable investment I ever made. The moment I stopped subsidizing their delusions, my entire life took off. I stopped paying the emotional tax of their constant need for approval. I stopped carrying the weight of their manufactured daily crises. I liquidated the fake family unit and kept the only asset that had ever actually been worth anything: my own competence and my own peace of mind. For decades, they looked at me and saw a weak, submissive target. A quiet woman in practical clothes, working long hours in a sterile cubicle. They saw a piggy bank they could smash open whenever Jason's next failure needed funding. They mistook my refusal to scream and throw tantrums for powerlessness. They mistook professional boundaries for a bluff and quiet patience for total submission. What they never understood was the nature of my profession or the way my mind actually worked. They thought my silence was weakness. It was an audit. I was always watching, always calculating the exact deficit their actions produced. And when the math finally demanded a full liquidation, I didn't hesitate to close their accounts for good. I let them take the rope they were so desperate for, and simply stood back and watched them tie their own knot. They destroyed themselves, in the end, because they never had the one thing you actually need to survive in the real world: accountability. I turned from the window and faced the camera set up on my desk, ready to record the final segment of my corporate podcast. Leaning forward, I rested my hands on the leather desk pad. Sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is watch someone you care about walk straight into a fire they built themselves. But sometimes it's the only way to keep yourself from burning right alongside them. You can't heal a deep infection by pretending it's just a